They said she was too young for love, too stubborn, too foolish. They laughed when she turned down every marriage offer in Red Hollow, laughed until the day she walked straight into a winter storm that should have killed her. But what she found in those frozen mountains wasn't death. It was a man who saw her as more than property, more than a burden. And when she came back to town, everything changed. This is the story of the girl who refused to settle, and the choice that split a frontier town in half. If you want to see how far a single decision can go, stay with me until the end. And when you're done, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The train depot in Red Hollow smelled like coal dust and bitter coffee. Eliza Warren stood on the platform with her worn coat pulled tight, watching the afternoon express roll in with a screech of brakes that set her teeth on edge. She wasn't waiting for anyone. She just needed somewhere to stand that wasn't the boarding house, where Mrs. Henley would corner her with another lecture about wasted opportunities. 3 marriage proposals in 4 months. All rejected. The town had opinions about that. There she is. The voice came from behind her, sharp enough to cut. Miss High and Mighty herself. Eliza didn't turn. She knew that voice. Caroline Brewster, the banker's daughter, who'd married at 16 and seemed to think that made her an expert on everyone else's life. Heard Thomas Greer asked you last week, Caroline continued, louder now. Her friends giggled. That's what, the 3rd one? Or did I lose count? Eliza kept her eyes on the train. Passengers were stepping down. A family with too many children, a salesman with a sample case, an old woman who needed help with the stairs. You think you're better than the rest of us? Caroline moved closer. Eliza could smell her rosewater perfume. Too strong, trying too hard. You think some prince is going to ride into Red Hollow and sweep you off your feet? I think, Eliza said quietly, still not turning, that marrying a man I don't love just because he asked isn't something to be proud of. The giggling stopped. Caroline's face went red. You little... Caroline. Mrs. Fletcher, the postmaster's wife, appeared at the edge of the platform. Her voice carried authority that came from 30 years of knowing everyone's business. That's enough. But the damage was done. Other people had heard. Other people were staring. Eliza walked away from the depot with her spine straight and her hands shaking. She made it 2 blocks before the tears started, and she hated herself for them. She wasn't sad. She was angry. Angry at a world where refusing to settle made you a spectacle, where choosing yourself over security made you a fool. The boarding house sat at the end of Main Street, a sagging 2-story building that had seen better days before Eliza was born. She climbed the stairs to her room, a space barely big enough for a bed and a trunk, and sat down hard on the mattress. Through the thin walls, she could hear Mrs. Henley talking to someone in the hallway. 18 years old and turning down good men left and right. Her parents would be ashamed. Eliza closed her eyes. Her parents were 6 years dead, killed when a wagon overturned on the mountain road. She'd been 12, old enough to remember everything, too young to do anything about it. She'll end up alone, another voice said. Mrs. Patterson from room 4. Mark my words, girls like that always do. Girls like that. As if wanting more than a loveless marriage made her defective. Eliza stood up and moved to the window. Outside, Red Hollow sprawled in all its dusty glory. Wooden buildings that never quite looked finished, dirt streets that turned to mud when it rained, people who measured worth in livestock and land. Beyond the town, the mountains rose like a wall, their peaks still white with early snow. She'd lived here her whole life, 18 years in a place that felt like a cage. A knock on the door made her jump. Eliza? Mrs. Henley's voice, falsely sweet. Can I come in? It's your house. The door opened. Mrs. Henley was a stout woman with iron gray hair and a face that seemed permanently set in disapproval. She stepped inside without being invited and closed the door behind her. I heard what happened at the depot. I'm sure you did. Don't take that tone with me, girl. Mrs. Henley crossed her arms. You're making yourself a laughingstock. Do you understand that? Thomas Greer is a good man with a good ranch. You could have had security, a home, children. I could have had a husband who looks at me like property, Eliza shot back. Thomas doesn't want a wife. He wants someone to cook and clean and give him sons. He told me that himself. And what's wrong with that? That's what marriage is. Not for me. Mrs. Henley's expression hardened. You think you're special. You think you deserve some grand romance like in those books you're always reading. But this is Red Hollow, not a fairy tale. This is real life. And in real life, women make practical choices. Then I guess I'm not practical. No. Mrs. Henley moved closer, her voice dropping. You're a stubborn, foolish girl who's going to end up with nothing. You have no family, no money, no prospects. In 6 months, when your savings run out, what are you going to do? Come crying to me for more time on the rent? Eliza felt something crack open inside her chest. I'll figure it out. You'll figure it out. Mrs. Henley laughed, sharp and bitter. You know what I think? I think you're scared. I think you're so terrified of being ordinary that you'd rather be miserable and alone than admit you're just like the rest of us. Get out. Excuse me? Get out of my room. Eliza's voice shook, but she held her ground. I pay rent. That means this space is mine until the end of the month. Get out. For a moment, Mrs. Henley looked like she might argue. Then she turned on her heel and left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. Eliza sat back down on the bed. Her hands were still shaking. Her throat was tight, but she didn't cry. She was done crying. The decision came to her that night, somewhere between midnight and dawn, when the world was quiet enough to hear herself think. She couldn't stay in Red Hollow, not anymore. Every day here was a battle she was tired of fighting, against expectations, against judgment, against the grinding certainty that this was all there was. She'd been telling herself she just needed to be patient, to wait for something better. But nothing better was coming, not here, so she would leave. The plan was simple, probably stupid, definitely desperate. She had enough money saved for a train ticket to the next town over, Carson Creek. About 50 miles east. It was bigger than Red Hollow, which meant more opportunities. Maybe she could find work. Maybe she could disappear into a place where nobody knew her story. She packed her trunk in the dark, moving quietly so Mrs. Henley wouldn't hear. 2 dresses, 1 pair of boots, her mother's silver hairbrush. A book of poetry her father had given her when she was 10. Not much to show for 18 years of living. By the time the sun came up, she was ready. The train left at noon. She had 6 hours. She spent the first hour walking through Red Hollow one last time, trying to memorize it, even though she wanted to forget. The general store where she'd bought penny candy as a child. The church where her parents' funeral had been held. The schoolhouse where she'd learned to read. The second hour, she sat by the creek at the edge of town and watched the water move. It was cold enough that ice had formed along the banks, delicate and temporary. She wondered if anyone would notice she was gone. The third hour, she went back to the boarding house to get her trunk. Mrs. Henley was waiting in the hallway. Going somewhere? Eliza didn't answer. She just moved past her, heading for the stairs. I asked you a question. I'm leaving. You'll have my room back by tonight. Mrs. Henley followed her up the stairs, her footsteps heavy on the wood. Leaving for where? Does it matter? You're running away. That's what this is. You're running because you can't face the truth, that you're wrong, and everyone else is right. Eliza reached her room and grabbed the trunk. It was heavier than she remembered. She dragged it into the hallway and started toward the stairs. You won't make it, Mrs. Henley said. Whatever you're planning, wherever you're going, you won't make it. You're not strong enough. You're not smart enough. You're just a scared little girl who thinks she's better than she is. Eliza stopped at the top of the stairs. She turned around. Maybe you're right, she said. Maybe I won't make it. Maybe I'll fail at everything I try. But at least I'll fail trying to be something more than what you are. She didn't wait for a response. She hauled the trunk down the stairs, through the front door, out into the cold morning air. She made it halfway to the depot before she realized she'd left her coat upstairs. The temperature had dropped overnight. The sky was heavy with clouds that promised snow. She could feel the cold seeping through her dress, biting at her skin. But going back meant facing Mrs. Henley again, and she couldn't do that. She wouldn't. She kept walking. The depot was nearly empty when she arrived. Just the station master, an old man named Polk who'd worked there since before Eliza was born, and a young couple waiting on the bench with their bags between them. Eliza bought her ticket with hands that had gone numb. Carson Creek, one way. Polk didn't ask questions. He just took her money and handed over the ticket with a nod. Train's running late, he said. Storm coming in from the west. Might be delayed another hour. An hour. She could wait an hour. She sat down on the bench as far from the couple as she could get. They were newlyweds, probably. The way they kept glancing at each other, the way he held her hand, young and hopeful and completely oblivious to how hard the world could be. Eliza looked away. The minutes crawled past. The clouds grew darker. The wind picked up, rattling the windows of the depot. Then the door opened, and Thomas Greer walked in. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick-armed, the kind of man who looked like he could break things without trying. His face was weathered from years of ranch work, his eyes pale blue and cold. He saw Eliza immediately. "Heard you were leaving." Her stomach dropped. News travels fast. Mrs. Henley sent word. He crossed the depot in 3 long strides and stood over her, too close, invading her space. "Told me you were running away like a coward." "I'm not running. I'm leaving. There's a difference." "Not from where I'm standing." He glanced at her trunk. "Carson Creek." "That where you're going?" She didn't answer. Thomas crouched down so they were eye level. His breath smelled like tobacco and something sour. "You turned me down 3 times. Made me look like a fool in front of the whole town. And now you're leaving because you can't handle the consequences." "I'm leaving because there's nothing here for me." "Nothing here?" His voice rose. The couple on the bench glanced over, nervous. "I offered you everything. A home, security, respect, and you spat in my face." "You offered me a prison." Eliza kept her voice steady even though her heart was hammering. "You don't want a wife, Thomas. You want a servant, and I'm not interested." His face went red. "You think you're better than me. I think I deserve better than you." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and final. Thomas stood up slowly. For a moment, Eliza thought he might hit her. The couple on the bench stood up too, the man moving protectively in front of his wife. "You're making a mistake," Thomas said quietly. "You're going to end up alone and broken, and when you do, don't come crawling back, because I won't be there." "Good." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Eliza's hands were shaking again. She pressed them against her knees, trying to steady herself. The young man from the bench walked over. "You all right, miss?" "I'm fine." "That man, is he going to cause trouble?" "No." She hoped that was true. "He's just angry. He'll get over it." The man nodded slowly, clearly unconvinced, but he went back to his wife without pressing further. Eliza sat there, breathing carefully, waiting for her pulse to slow down. The encounter had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Not because she was afraid of Thomas, though maybe she should be, but because it made everything feel more real. She was actually doing this. She was actually leaving. The train whistle sounded in the distance. Polk stepped out onto the platform. "She's coming in. 5 minutes." Eliza stood up and grabbed her trunk. The couple did the same. They all moved outside, where the wind had picked up enough to sting. The train appeared around the bend, black smoke pouring from its stack, wheels screeching as it slowed. It pulled into the station with a hiss of steam and a shudder of metal. The conductor stepped down and opened the passenger door. "All aboard for Carson Creek." The couple climbed on first. Eliza followed, dragging her trunk up the steep steps. Inside, the car was warm and dim, smelling of coal smoke and old leather. She found a seat by the window and shoved her trunk underneath. Through the glass, she could see Red Hollow spreading out below, the buildings, the people, the whole small world she was leaving behind. She waited to feel something. Relief, maybe. Or regret. Instead, she felt nothing, just empty. The train lurched forward. The wheels began to turn. And then, through the window, she saw him. Thomas Greer standing at the edge of the platform, watching the train leave. His face was hard. His hands were clenched into fists. He didn't wave. He didn't move. He just watched. Eliza turned away from the window. She closed her eyes and leaned back against the seat. She'd made her choice. Now she had to live with it. The train ride to Carson Creek should have taken 2 hours. Halfway there, it started to snow. At first, it was just a few flakes drifting past the window. Pretty, harmless. But within 20 minutes, the wind had picked up and the snow was coming down in thick, heavy sheets that turned the world white. The train slowed. Then slowed more. "Storm's getting bad," the conductor announced, moving through the car. "We're going to pull into the next station and wait it out. Should only be a delay of an hour or two. But when they reached the next station, a tiny outpost called Bridger's Stop, the station master met them on the platform with bad news. "Can't go any further," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Pass is snowed in. Won't be clear until tomorrow at the earliest. Tomorrow." Eliza felt panic rising in her chest. She had enough money for the train ticket and maybe one night in a cheap hotel. If she got stuck here for days, she'd run out of everything. The conductor herded everyone into the station house, a cramped building with a pot-bellied stove and a handful of benches. There were maybe 10 passengers total, all looking cold and annoyed. "We'll keep the fire going," the station master said. "You can wait here. There's a hotel up the road if you want a real bed." Eliza counted her money. She had just enough. She left her trunk at the station and walked up the road to the hotel, a 2-story building that looked like it had been built in a hurry and never quite finished. The owner, a tired-looking woman with streaks of gray in her hair, rented her a room for the night. "Storm's supposed to break by morning," the woman said. "You should be able to get out then." Eliza nodded and climbed the stairs to her room. It was small and cold, the bed lumpy, the window rattling in its frame. She sat down and tried to think. Tomorrow, she'd get back on the train. Tomorrow, she'd make it to Carson Creek. Tomorrow, everything would start over. She believed that right up until the moment she woke up and saw how much snow had fallen. The window was completely covered. When she pressed her face against the glass, all she could see was white. The storm hadn't broken. If anything, it had gotten worse. She went downstairs to find the hotel owner standing by the front door, staring out at the street. "Lord have mercy," the woman muttered. "Haven't seen a storm like this in 10 years. When will the trains run again?" "Not today. Maybe not tomorrow either. This is the kind of snow that shuts everything down." Eliza's stomach dropped. How long? Could be 3 days, could be a week. Depends on when the crews can get through to clear the tracks. A week. She didn't have money for a week. "Is there anywhere I can find work?" Eliza asked. "Just temporary, until I can leave." The woman looked her over. "You know how to clean?" "Yes." "Kitchen work?" "I can learn." The woman sighed. "I'll give you a job helping out here. Room and board, no pay. Fair?" It wasn't fair, but it was better than freezing to death in the street. "Fair," Eliza said. She spent the rest of that day scrubbing floors and washing dishes, her hands raw from the lye soap, her back aching. The hotel owner, her name was Mrs. Calloway, was brusque but not cruel. She showed Eliza how things worked and left her alone to do the job. By nightfall, Eliza was exhausted. She fell asleep in her lumpy bed and didn't wake up until morning. When she did, the storm was still raging. 3 days passed like that. 3 days of work and waiting, of watching the snow pile higher and higher outside. The train passengers who'd been stuck at Bridger's Stop started getting restless. Some of them pooled money to hire a wagon and try to make it through. They left on the morning of the 4th day. They were back by noon, half frozen, saying the roads were impassable. On the 5th day, Eliza realized she was running out of time. Her trunk was still at the station. Her savings were almost gone. She'd been wearing the same dress for 5 days straight, and she could feel herself starting to unravel. Physically, mentally, all of it. That night, she stood by the window of her room and stared out at the endless white. The storm showed no signs of stopping. The world had disappeared. She thought about Red Hollow, about Mrs. Henley's voice saying you won't make it, about Thomas Greer watching her leave. Maybe they'd been right. Maybe she wasn't strong enough. Maybe this was what happened to girls who refused to settle. They ended up stranded in the middle of nowhere with nothing and no one, waiting for a storm to pass that might never end. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and closed her eyes. She didn't hear the voice at first. It was too quiet, too far away. But then it came again, louder. "Eliza?" She turned. Mrs. Calloway was standing in the doorway, her face pale. "There's a man downstairs asking for you." Eliza's heart stopped. "What man?" "Says his name is Greer, Thomas Greer." The room tilted. "He's here?" "Says he came to bring you home." Mrs. Calloway hesitated. "He doesn't look friendly." Eliza's mind raced. Thomas had followed her. Through the storm, through the snow, he'd tracked her down. And if he was here, it wasn't to apologize. "Tell him I'm not here," she said quickly. "Tell him I left. Tell him anything." Mrs. Calloway shook her head. "He already knows you're here. He asked the station master. Everyone knows." Eliza felt the walls closing in. There was nowhere to go, no way out. "He's waiting in the lobby," Mrs. Calloway said quietly. "You don't have to go down there. I can send him away." But they both knew that wouldn't work. If Thomas had come this far, he wasn't leaving without her. Eliza took a breath, then another. Then she walked to the door. "I'll talk to him." She descended the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The lobby was empty except for Thomas, who stood by the fire with his back to her. He was covered in snow, his coat soaked through, his hands red from the cold. He heard her footsteps and turned. "There you are." His voice was calm, too calm. "You shouldn't have come," Eliza said. "You're right. I shouldn't have had to." He moved closer. "You should have stayed in Red Hollow, where you belong." "I don't belong there. You belong where I say you belong." He was close enough now that she could see the anger in his eyes, barely contained. "You embarrassed me, Eliza, made me look like a fool, and now I've had to ride through a storm to drag you back like a runaway child." "I'm not going back." Thomas smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "You don't have a choice." "Yes, I do." "No." He reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to hurt. "You don't. You're coming with me. Tonight. And you're going to marry me, and you're going to stop acting like a spoiled brat who thinks she's too good for the world." Eliza tried to pull away. His grip tightened. "Let go of me." "Not until you agree." "Let go." "Is there a problem here?" Mrs. Calloway appeared at the top of the stairs, holding a cast-iron skillet in one hand. "Because if there is, I'm happy to solve it." Thomas looked at her, then at the skillet, then back at Eliza. "This is between me and her." "Not in my hotel, it's not." Mrs. Calloway descended the stairs, still holding the skillet. "Let her go. Now." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Thomas released Eliza's arm. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "The only mistake I made," Eliza said, "was thinking you were anything more than a bully." His face twisted. "You'll regret this. I already regret ever meeting you." Thomas stared at her, his jaw working. Then he turned and walked toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the handle. "When you're alone and broken," he said without turning around, "remember this moment. Remember that you chose it." He left. The door slammed behind him. Eliza stood there, shaking, her arm throbbing where he'd grabbed her. Mrs. Calloway set the skillet down and put a hand on her shoulder. "You all right?" "I don't know." "He'll be back." "I know." Mrs. Calloway squeezed her shoulder. "Then you'd better be gone before he is." That night, Eliza couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside. Thomas's words kept echoing in her head. "You'll regret this. You chose it. Maybe she had chosen wrong. Maybe running away had been the stupidest thing she'd ever done. But going back, letting him win, that felt like dying." Somewhere around midnight, she made a decision. She couldn't go back to Red Hollow. She couldn't stay at Bridger's Stop. And she couldn't wait for the storm to end, because by then Thomas might return with reinforcements. Which meant she had one option left. She got dressed in the dark, pulling on every layer she had. She went downstairs and raided the kitchen, stuffing bread and dried meat into her pockets. She found a lantern and lit it. Then she walked out into the storm. The cold hit her like a wall. The wind tore at her clothes. The snow was knee-deep already and falling harder. She couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction, but she kept walking. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have supplies. She had a half-broken lantern, a pocket full of food, and a stubborn refusal to give up. The town disappeared behind her. The road disappeared beneath her feet. She was walking blind, guided only by the faint glow of her lantern and a desperate hope that she'd find something, anything, before she froze to death. An hour passed, maybe two. Time lost meaning in the white void. Her fingers went numb. Her face burned from the cold. She stumbled and fell, got up, fell again. She was going to die out here. The thought came clearly, calmly. She was going to die alone in the snow, and no one would find her until spring. But at least it would be her choice. She took another step, then another. The lantern flickered and went out. Darkness closed in. She fell one more time and didn't get up. The snow covered her like a blanket. The cold seeped into her bones. She closed her eyes and waited for the end. And then she heard footsteps. The footsteps were real, heavy and deliberate, crunching through the snow with a rhythm that didn't falter. Eliza tried to lift her head but couldn't. Her body had stopped listening to her. The cold had won. Then hands were on her, turning her over. A face appeared above her, dark and blurred through the falling snow. She couldn't make out features, couldn't tell if it was friend or enemy, couldn't tell if it mattered anymore. "Can you hear me?" The voice was low, careful. Not Thomas, someone else. She tried to answer, but her jaw wouldn't move. Everything was shutting down, piece by piece. The hands lifted her. She was being carried now, held against a chest that radiated warmth. Her head lolled against a shoulder. The world tilted and swayed, and then there was only darkness. When consciousness came back, it came in fragments. The crackle of fire, the smell of smoke and leather. Warmth creeping back into her fingers, painful and slow. She was lying on something soft, furs maybe, and there was a blanket over her, heavy and rough. She opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was made of wood and canvas, curved like the inside of a barrel. A shelter of some kind, small and dim. Firelight danced across the walls. She turned her head and saw him. He was sitting by the fire, his back to her, feeding wood into the flames. Broad shoulders, long black hair tied back, skin brown like the earth after rain. He wore buckskin and wool, layered for the cold. She couldn't see his face. She tried to sit up. Her body protested, every muscle aching. He turned at the sound of her movement. His face was angular, sharp-featured, eyes dark and unreadable. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. "You should rest," he said finally. His voice was quiet, almost flat, like someone who wasn't used to talking much. "Where am I?" Her own voice came out hoarse and cracked. "Safe." That wasn't an answer, but before she could press, a wave of dizziness hit her. She lay back down, breathing carefully. "What happened?" "You walked into a storm." He turned back to the fire. "Nearly died." The memory came back in pieces. Leaving the hotel. The endless white. The cold sinking into her bones. She'd been ready to die out there. "Why did you save me?" He didn't answer right away, just kept feeding the fire, methodical and patient. "Seemed like the right thing," he said eventually. Eliza stared at the curved ceiling, trying to make sense of it. She was alive. She shouldn't be, but she was. And this stranger had pulled her out of the snow for no reason, except that it seemed right. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded once, not looking at her. "What's your name?" A pause. "Cade." "I'm Eliza." Another nod. No words this time. She lay there in the silence, listening to the fire pop and the wind howl outside. Her body was starting to thaw, which meant the pain was coming back. The sharp sting in her fingers and toes, the deep ache in her bones. But she was warm. She was alive. "How far are we from Bridger's stop?" she asked. 5 miles? Maybe 6. 5 miles! In that storm, it might as well have been 500. There was no going back. "Is there another town nearby?" "No." The word hung in the air, final and certain. "So what do I do?" Cade glanced at her over his shoulder. His expression didn't change. "You stay here until the storm passes. Then you decide." "Stay here? In this shelter? You have somewhere else to go?" She didn't. That was the problem. Cade stood up, moving with an easy grace that made no sound. He was tall, she realized. Taller than Thomas, leaner but no less strong. He picked up a skin bag from the corner of the shelter and brought it to her. "Drink?" She took it. Inside was water, cold and clean. She drank until her throat stopped burning. "There's food if you're hungry," he said, nodding toward a bundle near the fire. "Not much. Dried meat, some bread." "I'm fine." He gave her a look that said he didn't believe her, but he didn't argue. He just went back to his spot by the fire and sat down again. Eliza watched him. He moved like someone who was comfortable with silence, who didn't need conversation to fill the space. It was strange after so many years in Red Hollow, where everyone always had something to say. "You live out here?" she asked. "Sometimes." "Alone?" Mostly. Getting information out of him was like pulling teeth, but she was too tired to push. She closed her eyes and listened to the storm. Eventually, exhaustion dragged her under again. When she woke the second time, the light had changed. Gray filtered through the gaps in the shelter, and the wind had died down to a low moan. Cade was still by the fire, working on something with his hands. A piece of leather, it looked like, and a bone needle. He noticed her watching. Storm's breaking. Should be clear by tomorrow. And then what? Then you go wherever you were going. She sat up slowly this time, testing her strength. Everything hurt, but it was manageable. What if I don't have anywhere to go? His hands paused in their work. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes, not quite curiosity, but close. Why were you walking in the storm? I was running away. From what? She hesitated. The truth felt too heavy, too complicated, but lying seemed pointless. From a man who thought he owned me. Cade's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air between them. Did he hurt you? He tried. The hands went back to work on the leather. Will he come looking? Probably. Then you need a plan. I had a plan. It didn't work out. Cade made a sound that might have been a laugh, though it was too quiet to be sure. Plans don't mean much in a storm. So what do? When you don't have a plan? You survive. Everything else comes after. It was the most he'd said at once, and there was something in his voice, not wisdom exactly, but the weight of experience. He knew what he was talking about. Eliza pulled the blanket tighter around herself. Can I ask you something? You just did. That was definitely almost a smile. Why do you live out here? Alone? The smile, if it had been there, disappeared. Cade set down the leather and the needle. People in towns ask too many questions. Sorry. Don't be. Just don't expect answers. Fair enough. She watched him work in silence for a while. His hands were steady, practiced. Whatever he was making, he'd done it before. You're not from around here, she said after a while. It wasn't a question. No. Where are you from? He didn't answer, just kept working. Sorry, she said again. I'll stop asking. It's not a secret. His voice was quiet. I just don't talk about it. Why not? Because talking doesn't change anything. There was a finality to that statement that made her drop it. She had secrets too. She understood. The day passed slowly. Cade left the shelter once to check on something outside. She heard him moving around, the crunch of his boots in the snow. When he came back, he brought more wood for the fire and a rabbit, already skinned and cleaned. You hunt? She said, watching him prepare the meat. How else would I eat? Fair point. He set the rabbit on a spit over the fire and sat back. The smell of cooking meat filled the shelter, making her stomach clench with hunger. She realized she hadn't eaten anything substantial in days. When the meat was done, he cut off a piece and handed it to her on a flat stone. She ate without speaking, too hungry to care about manners. It was tough and gamey, but it was food, and that was all that mattered. Cade ate his portions slowly, chewing carefully, watching the fire. When they were done, he gathered up the bones and set them aside. You can stay until you're strong enough to travel, he said. After that, it's your choice. My choice to do what? Whatever you want. The words hit harder than they should have. Whatever she wanted. When was the last time anyone had said that to her? What if I don't know what I want? Cade looked at her. Then you stay until you figure it out. Something in her chest loosened. Not hope exactly, but close enough. Why are you helping me? She asked. Already told you. No, you said it seemed right. That's not an answer. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I know what it's like to run from something. I know what it's like to have nowhere to go. If I can help someone else not die in the snow, I will. It was the most honest thing he'd said, and it made her want to cry. She didn't, though. She just nodded. Thank you, she said again. He nodded back. The second night was quieter than the first. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world buried in white. Eliza lay under the blanket, staring at the shelter ceiling, thinking about everything that had brought her here. Red Hollow felt like a lifetime ago. Thomas felt like a nightmare she'd almost escaped. Cade? Yeah? The man I was running from. His name is Thomas Greer. If he comes looking for me, he won't find you. How do you know? Because no one finds this place unless I want them to. There was certainty in his voice that she wanted to believe. So she did. She fell asleep to the sound of the fire and woke to pale sunlight filtering through the shelter. The storm had broken. Outside, the world was blindingly white and utterly still. Cade was already awake, crouched by the entrance, looking out. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Deep, 2 feet at least, maybe more in the drifts. Can I travel in that?" He turned to look at her. "Not today, maybe not tomorrow." She should have felt trapped. Instead, she felt relieved. The days began to blur together. Cade left each morning to check his traps, always coming back with something: rabbit, squirrel, once a grouse. He showed her how to prepare the meat, how to stretch the skins, how to keep the fire going without wasting wood. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words were careful and deliberate. Eliza started helping without being asked. She learned quickly, watching how he moved, how he worked. He didn't praise her when she got something right, but he didn't criticize when she got it wrong either. He just showed her again, patient and quiet. On the 4th day, she asked him about the shelter. "Did you build this?" "Yeah." "How long did it take?" "A week, maybe less." She looked around at the careful construction, the bent poles, the layered canvas and hide, the way everything fit together to keep out the cold. "You're good at this," he shrugged. "Had to be." "Where did you learn?" "My father." It was the first time he'd mentioned family. She wanted to ask more, but held back. He'd tell her when he was ready, or he wouldn't. Either way was fine. That night, they sat by the fire eating roasted squirrel. The meat was tougher than the rabbit, stringy and strong-flavored. Eliza chewed carefully, trying not to think about what it would have been like to eat this back in Red Hollow, where people would have turned their noses up at the idea. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Cade glanced at her. "Go ahead." "Why don't you go into town? For supplies, or, I don't know, company?" "Don't need supplies, don't want company." "Ever?" He set down his food. "I went into town once, Bridger's Stop, about 3 years ago. Needed salt, some other things I couldn't make. The storekeeper wouldn't sell to me. Said I wasn't welcome." Eliza felt her stomach turn. Because of what I am." His voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "They don't say it to your face, usually. They just make it clear you're not wanted, so I stopped going." "That's not right." "No, but it's how it is." She wanted to argue, to tell him that not everyone was like that, but she couldn't. She'd seen it herself, the way Red Hollow treated anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable, the way they'd treated her for refusing to marry Thomas. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Don't be sorry. Just don't be like them." "I won't." He looked at her for a moment, something unreadable in his eyes. Then he went back to eating. The days continued. Eliza grew stronger, her body recovering from the near-death experience in the snow. She learned to set snares, to recognize animal tracks, to tell when a storm was coming by the way the wind shifted. Cade taught her without fanfare, showing her once and expecting her to remember. She found herself watching him when he wasn't looking. The way he moved, efficient and unhurried. The way his hands worked, quick and sure. He didn't waste motion. He didn't waste words. Everything he did had purpose. One afternoon, she was helping him scrape a hide when her knife slipped and cut her palm. It wasn't deep, but it bled freely. Cade took her hand without asking, examining the cut. His touch was careful, almost gentle. "Hold still." He pulled a leather pouch from his pack and took out a small clay jar. Inside was a paste that smelled like pine and something bitter. He spread it over the cut, then wrapped her hand with a strip of clean cloth. "What is that?" she asked. "Medicine. Keeps it from going bad." "Where did you get it?" "Made it." "You made medicine?" "It's not complicated, just plants and animal fat." But the way he said it, casual and certain, told her it was more complicated than he let on. He knew things, practical, useful things that people in towns paid money to learn. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and went back to scraping the hide. Her hand throbbed that night, but by morning the pain had eased. The cut was already starting to close, the edges pink and clean. Whatever he'd put on it had worked. A week passed, then another. The snow began to settle, packing down under its own weight. The world outside the shelter stayed frozen and silent, but inside, something was changing. Eliza found herself talking more, telling Cade about Red Hollow, about her parents, about the years after they died when she'd felt like she was just waiting for something to happen. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. "I thought leaving would fix everything," she said one night. "Like if I could just get out, I'd figure out who I was supposed to be." And I almost died in the snow. "But you didn't, because you saved me." "You saved yourself," Cade said. "I just kept you from freezing." She wanted to argue, but there was truth in what he said. She'd made the choice to walk into that storm. She'd made the choice to keep going even when every instinct told her to stop. He'd found her, yes, but she'd gotten herself far enough to be found. "What about you?" she asked. "What are you running from?" His expression closed off. "Who says I'm running?" "You live alone in the middle of nowhere. You won't go into town. You don't talk about your past. You're running from something." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "My people." "Your people?" "My tribe. My family. I left." "Why?" "Because I didn't fit. Because they wanted me to be something I wasn't, so I walked away." The words were simple, but she heard the weight behind them, the pain. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. "Some days." He looked at her. "But I'm still alive. That counts for something." It did. She understood that now. The next morning, Cade announced they were going to move. "Move where?" "Deeper into the mountains. This shelter was always temporary. I have a better place, more permanent. We'll go there." "We?" He looked at her. "You're not strong enough to travel to a town yet. And even if you were, where would you go?" She didn't have an answer. "You come with me," he said, "until you're ready to leave, if you want." It wasn't a command. It was an offer. "Okay," she said. They packed up the shelter, which turned out to be easier than she expected. Cade had designed it to be portable. The poles came apart. The canvas and hides rolled up tight. Within an hour, everything was strapped to a frame he'd built for carrying supplies. He showed her how to walk in the snow with makeshift shoes he'd made from bent wood and leather webbing. They were awkward at first, but she got the hang of it. Without them, she'd have sunk to her waist with every step. The journey took most of the day. They climbed steadily upward, following a path only Cade could see. The forest closed in around them, dense and silent. Eliza's legs burned from the effort, but she didn't complain. Cade set a pace she could match and didn't push beyond it. By late afternoon, they reached a clearing. In the center stood a structure more permanent than the shelter they'd left behind. A small cabin built of logs and stone, low to the ground and solid. Smoke rose from a chimney. "Someone's here," Eliza said, stopping. "No one's here. I left the fire going." "You left? It's safe. I banked it before I left to check the traps." "That's when I found you." He'd been out checking traps when he'd saved her life. She hadn't known that. Cade led her to the cabin. Inside it was warm and dim, the fire burning low in a stone hearth. There was a sleeping platform along one wall, shelves along another, a table and 2 stools. Simple, functional, clean. "You built this," she said. "Took me most of a summer." She walked around the small space, taking it in. It was more than a shelter. It was a home. "You can sleep there," Cade said, nodding to the platform. "I'll sleep by the fire." "I can't take your bed." "I'm not using it. Don't argue." She didn't. That night, lying on the sleeping platform under a pile of furs, Eliza stared at the ceiling and tried to process everything that had happened. 2 weeks ago, she'd been in Red Hollow, refusing marriage proposals and being told she was a fool. Now she was in a cabin in the mountains with a man who barely spoke but had saved her life anyway. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. But somehow, for the first time in years, she didn't feel trapped. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm. Cade taught her to hunt with snares, to fish through the ice, to read the forest like a book. He showed her which plants were safe to eat and which would kill her. He taught her to sew leather with sinew, to keep her knife sharp, to move quietly through the trees. He never made her feel stupid for not knowing. He just showed her, over and over, until she got it right. Eliza found herself changing. Her hands, soft and useless in Red Hollow, grew calloused and strong. Her body, which had always felt like something she carried instead of lived in, became a tool she understood. She learned to trust her instincts, to listen to the voice in her head that said, keep going or stop here or this is dangerous. And she learned to be quiet, not uncomfortable silence, but the kind of quiet that came from being at peace with yourself. Cade changed too, though more subtly. He talked more, his words coming easier. He smiled sometimes, rare, brief, but real. He watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, and she caught him doing it more than once. One evening, they were sitting by the fire after a long day of checking traps. Eliza was working on a pair of mittens, stitching leather carefully. Cade was sharpening his knife, the blade singing against the whetstone. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "Why did you really save me?" He stopped sharpening. "I told you. I know what you told me, but there's more to it. You didn't just pull me out of the snow. You brought me here. You're teaching me to survive. Why?" Cade set down the knife and the stone. He stared at the fire for a long time. "Because I saw someone who refused to give up," he said finally. "Even when giving up would have been easier. And I thought—" He paused. "I thought maybe someone like that was worth saving." Her throat tightened. "I didn't refuse to give up. I was dying. But you walked into the storm anyway. You chose the unknown over the thing you were running from. That takes strength. Or stupidity. Maybe both." She laughed, unexpected and genuine. Cade's mouth curved into something that might have been a smile. "I'm glad you found me," she said quietly. "So am I." The words hung in the air between them, significant in a way neither of them wanted to name. Another week passed. The snow began to melt at the edges, revealing the brown earth beneath. Spring was still far off, but the promise of it was there. One morning, Eliza woke to find Cade already gone. She dressed and went outside, expecting to find him nearby, but the clearing was empty. She checked the traps, the woodpile, the path to the stream. Nothing. He didn't come back until late afternoon, carrying a pack over his shoulder. His face was tight, closed off. "Where were you?" she asked. "Had something to take care of." "What?" He didn't answer, just went inside and started unloading the pack. Salt, a spool of thread, a small knife with a bone handle. "You went to town," Eliza said, following him in. "To Bridger's stop." "Yeah." "Why?" "We needed supplies." "But you said—" "I know what I said." His voice was sharp, cutting. "I went, got what we needed. It's done." She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands moved too quickly, betraying emotion he didn't want to show. "Did something happen?" "Nothing I can't handle." "Cade, drop it, Eliza." She did, but she watched him for the rest of the evening. He was quieter than usual, his movements jerky and off. When he thought she wasn't looking, his jaw would tighten and his eyes would go hard. That night she asked again, "What happened in town?" He was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. For a long time he didn't answer. Then he said, "Someone recognized me. From before. Said some things." "What kind of things?" "The kind that remind you that you're not welcome." Her chest ached. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I knew what I was walking into." "Then why did you go?" He looked at her. "Because you're here, and you need things I can't make, so I went." The weight of that settled over her. He'd gone into a place that hated him because she needed salt and thread. He'd put himself through that for her. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yeah, I did." She crossed the cabin and sat down next to him by the fire. She didn't touch him, didn't say anything else, just sat there, sharing the silence. After a while, Cade said, "When I left my tribe, I thought I'd be free. No more expectations, no more pretending to be something I wasn't. But freedom just means you're alone, no one to rely on, no one who cares if you live or die." "That's not true." "It was. Until you." Her breath caught. "I'm not good with words," Cade continued, "and I don't know what this is. But you're not alone out here, and neither am I." She turned to look at him. His face was open in a way she'd never seen, vulnerable and honest. "I care if you live or die," she said. "I know." They sat there by the fire as the night deepened, not speaking, just being. And for the first time since her parents died, Eliza felt like she belonged somewhere. The next morning, everything was different. Not in any way she could name, but she felt it, a shift in the air between them. Cade's eyes stayed on her longer. Her heartbeat quickened when he came near. They didn't talk about it. They just kept living, day by day, building something neither of them had words for. And then, 3 days later, someone knocked on the cabin door. Eliza froze. Cade was on his feet before the second knock came, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. He motioned for her to stay back, then moved to the door. "Who's there?" "Mrs. Calloway, from Bridger's Stop." Eliza's heart hammered. Cade glanced at her, a question in his eyes. She nodded. It was safe. He opened the door. Mrs. Calloway stood on the threshold, bundled in a heavy coat, her face red from the cold. Behind her stood a man Eliza didn't recognize, older, gray-bearded, wearing a marshal's badge on his coat. "Miss Warren," Mrs. Calloway said, her voice tight with urgency. "We need to talk." Cade didn't move from the doorway. "About what?" The marshal spoke up. "About Thomas Greer and the men he's bringing with him." The world tilted. Eliza stepped forward. "What men?" Mrs. Calloway's expression was grim. "He came back to Bridger's Stop 2 days ago. Told everyone you'd been kidnapped by a savage. Said he was putting together a search party to bring you home." "That's a lie," Eliza said sharply. "I left on my own." "I know that," Mrs. Calloway said. "I told them that. But Thomas has half the town believing his story. He's got 8 men ready to ride out at first light tomorrow. They're coming here." Cade's jaw tightened. "How do they know where here is?" The marshal shifted uncomfortably. "Greer went into town 3 days ago. Asked questions. Someone told him about seeing a native man up in these mountains. Put 2 and 2 together, I guess." "Someone told him," Cade repeated, his voice flat. "Who?" "Does it matter?" Mrs. Calloway cut in. "They're coming, and if they find you both here, there's going to be trouble." Eliza felt her chest constrict. This was her fault. She'd brought this down on him. "Why are you telling us this?" Cade asked. The marshal spoke again. "Because what Greer's planning isn't justice, it's revenge, and I don't hold with that. Neither does Mrs. Calloway." "We thought you deserved a warning," Mrs. Calloway added. "Time to prepare or time to leave? Your choice." Cade looked at Eliza. She saw the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of options. "How many men, you said?" 8, not counting Greer. All armed. Some of them are good men who believe they're doing the right thing. Some of them are just looking for an excuse to cause trouble. "And you?" Cade asked the marshal. "Where do you stand?" "I stand with the truth," the man said evenly. "But I'm one man. Can't stop 9 others if they're determined." Silence stretched between them. Eliza felt panic rising in her throat. She'd run from Thomas once. She couldn't keep running forever. "I'll go back," she said suddenly. "I'll go back to Bridger's Stop and tell everyone the truth. That I left on my own, that Cade saved my life. They'll listen." "They won't," Mrs. Calloway interrupted. "I already tried. Thomas has them convinced. He showed them your trunk from the station, said you wouldn't have left it behind if you'd had a choice. He's painted himself as the hero and you as the victim. Facts don't matter when people have already made up their minds." "Then what do we do?" Eliza's voice cracked. Cade's hand found her shoulder, steady and grounding. "We face them." "Are you insane?" Mrs. Calloway looked between them. 9 armed men against 2 of you? That's not facing them. That's suicide." "I won't run from my own home," Cade said quietly. "And I won't let them drag Eliza back to a life she doesn't want." The marshal studied him for a long moment. "You're going to make a stand." "If I have to. Then you're going to need help." The marshal reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. "This is a statement from Mrs. Calloway, testifying that Miss Warren left Bridger's Stop of her own free will. I witnessed it. It's legal." He handed it to Eliza. She unfolded it with shaking hands, reading the careful script. "Will this stop them?" she asked. "No," the marshal said honestly, "but it might give you leverage, and it's proof that at least some people in Bridger's Stop are on your side." Mrs. Calloway stepped forward. "There's more. Not everyone believes Thomas. There are 3 families who've said they'll speak for you if it comes to that. The Hendersons, the Yates, and old Samuel Porter. They remember your parents, Eliza. They know you're not the kind of girl who needs rescuing. It wasn't much, but it was something." "Thank you," Eliza said, her voice thick. "Both of you." for coming all this way. Mrs. Calloway's expression softened. You worked hard for me, girl. Never complained, never caused trouble. I don't forget that. And I don't like bullies. The marshal nodded. We should go. The longer we're gone, the more questions people will ask. But you've got until tomorrow morning. Use that time well. Cade showed them out. Eliza watched through the window as they disappeared into the trees, two figures moving through the snow, taking a risk just to warn people they barely knew. When Cade came back inside, his face was unreadable. We need a plan, he said. Eliza sank down onto the bench by the fire. Her hands were shaking again. You should send me away. This isn't your fight. Yes, it is. Cade, you think I'm going to let 9 men ride up here and take you back to someone who tried to hurt you? His voice was harder than she'd ever heard it. You think I'm going to walk away from that? I think you've already done enough, more than enough. You saved my life. You taught me to survive. You don't owe me anything else. He crouched down in front of her, his eyes level with hers. This isn't about owing. This is about what's right, and what's right is standing between you and those men. Even if it gets you killed? I've been ready to die since the day I left my tribe. At least this way it'll mean something. Her throat closed up. She reached out and took his hand, gripping it hard. I don't want you to die for me. Then help me figure out how we both stay alive. They spent the rest of that day preparing. Cade moved through the cabin with focused intensity, checking weapons, gathering supplies, reinforcing the door and windows. Eliza helped where she could, following his instructions without question. They'll come at dawn, Cade said, working on the door. That's when men like that always come. They think surprise gives them advantage. Does it? Only if you're actually surprised. He showed her how to bar the door from the inside, how to use the furniture as barriers, how to move quickly between the windows. The cabin was small, but he'd built it with defense in mind. Narrow windows, thick walls, clear sight lines. You really thought about this, she said. I thought about a lot of things when I built this place. Men coming to hurt me was one of them. That night, neither of them slept. They sat by the fire, weapons within reach, waiting for the dawn. Eliza kept thinking about Thomas, about the hatred in his eyes when she'd rejected him. He wouldn't stop. Not until he got what he wanted, or someone made him stop. Tell me about your tribe, she said quietly. About why you left. Cade was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, My mother was from the Crow. My father was white, a trapper who stayed with the tribe for a few years. When he left, I was 3. Didn't remember him. But I looked like him enough that everyone else did. They treated you differently. Some did, some didn't. But I always felt like I was between 2 worlds, not really belonging to either. When I got older, the elders wanted me to prove myself, prove I was Crow, not white. So I did everything they asked, hunted, fought, followed every rule. It was never enough. So you left. I left. Figured if I was going to be alone either way, I might as well choose it for myself. Eliza understood that, the choosing part, the deciding that being alone on your own terms was better than being alone in a crowd. Do you regret it? She asked. I used to. Not anymore. Why not? He looked at her. Because I found something out here I never found with my tribe. Peace. And then I found you. Her heart ached. I'm sorry I brought trouble to your peace. You brought more than trouble. His voice was soft. You brought life. This cabin was just a place to survive before you got here. Now it's something else. She didn't know what to say to that. So she just moved closer, and he put his arm around her, and they sat there in the firelight waiting for morning. Dawn came cold and gray. Cade was at the window before the sun cleared the mountains, watching the tree line. Eliza stood behind him, her hands clenched into fists. How will we know when they're coming? We'll know. An hour passed, then another. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist. Eliza's nerves stretched tighter with every minute of silence. Then Cade straightened. There. She moved to the window. At first she didn't see anything, then movement caught her eye, dark shapes moving through the trees, too organized to be animals. Men on horseback, 9 of them, picking their way through the snow. Thomas was in front. Even from a distance, she recognized the way he sat in the saddle, rigid and angry. The men behind him were bundled against the cold, rifles visible across their saddles. "They're really coming," she whispered. "Yeah." Cade moved away from the window. "Remember what I told you. Stay low. Don't show yourself unless I say. If shooting starts, get behind the hearth. The stone will stop bullets." "What are you going to do?" "Talk first. Fight if I have to." He picked up his rifle and checked it one more time. Then he opened the door and stepped outside. Eliza's instinct was to follow, but she forced herself to stay put. She watched through the window as Cade walked to the center of the clearing, rifle held loosely in one hand, not threatening, but not defenseless either. The riders emerged from the trees and stopped at the edge of the clearing. Thomas dismounted first, followed by the others. They formed a loose line, facing Cade across 30 feet of snow. "You know why we're here?" Thomas called out. "I can guess," Cade said. His voice was calm, carrying easily in the cold air. "We're here for Eliza Warren." "You've got no right to keep her." "I'm not keeping anyone." "Then send her out." "Can't do that." Thomas's face darkened. "You kidnapped her, took her from town. She's been missing for weeks." "She wasn't kidnapped. She was dying in the snow and I saved her life. There's a difference." "That's a lie," one of the other men said. "We all know what you people do." "Shut up, Curtis," Thomas snapped. He turned back to Cade. "I don't care what story you're telling yourself. She belongs in town, with her own people." "Her own people left her to freeze to death," Cade said evenly. "I'm the one who brought her back." "You're a savage living in the woods. You don't get to decide what's best for a white woman." The words hung in the air, ugly and blunt. Eliza felt rage burn through her chest. She moved to the door, but Cade's voice stopped her before she could open it. "Eliza, stay inside." She froze. Thomas smiled. "So she is here. Send her out, now, or we come in and get her." "You can try," Cade said quietly. The temperature in the clearing seemed to drop 10 degrees. The men behind Thomas shifted, hands moving toward their rifles. Eliza couldn't stay silent anymore. She opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. "I'm here," she said, her voice ringing clear, "and I'm not going anywhere with you, Thomas." Thomas's expression shifted from triumph to something darker. "Eliza, thank the Lord you're safe. We've been so worried." "Don't," she cut him off. "Don't pretend you came here out of concern. You came here because you can't stand that I chose to leave, that I chose not to marry you. You didn't choose anything. You were confused, desperate, and this man took advantage. This man saved my life." Her voice cracked with fury. "I walked into that storm on my own because staying in Bridger's stop meant staying within your reach. I would rather have died than let you control me. Cade found me when I was nearly frozen, and he brought me back. He asked for nothing. He treated me with more respect in one day than you showed me in months." "You don't know what you're saying," Thomas said, his voice strained. "He's got you confused. That's what they do. They trick you, make you think. I know exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying I'm not coming back. I'm saying this is my choice, my life, and you don't get a vote." Thomas took a step forward. "You're coming back even if I have to drag you." Cade moved between them, smooth and fast. "No, she's not." "Get out of my way!" "Make me." For a moment, nobody moved. The tension was a physical thing, pressing down on all of them. Then one of Thomas's men raised his rifle. "Put it down," Cade said, his own rifle coming up to his shoulder in one fluid motion. "Right now!" "You shoot him, we shoot you," another man said, his rifle also rising. Within seconds, every gun in the clearing was pointed at someone. Eliza's heart hammered. This was about to turn into a bloodbath. "Stop!" The voice came from the trees. Everyone turned. Marshal Carson emerged on horseback, followed by Mrs. Calloway and 3 other people Eliza recognized from Bridger's stop. Samuel Porter, gray and weathered, John Henderson and his wife Margaret, solid and stern. "What the hell are you doing here?" Thomas demanded. "Preventing murder," the marshal said, dismounting. He walked into the clearing, positioning himself where everyone could see him. "Lower your weapons, all of you, now." "This is none of your concern, Marshal," Thomas said. "It's entirely my concern. I'm a lawman, and you're about to commit a crime." "The crime's already been committed. He kidnapped her." "No, he didn't." The marshal pulled out Mrs. Calloway's statement. "This is a sworn testimony that Eliza Warren left Bridger's stop of her own free will. I witnessed it myself. She wasn't kidnapped. She left." "That doesn't mean anything," Curtis said. He could have found her after and what? Nursed her back to health? Gave her food and shelter? Treated her with basic human decency? Mrs. Calloway's voice was sharp. Is that the crime you're accusing him of? Samuel Porter spoke up, his voice raspy but firm. I knew Eliza's parents, good people, raised their daughter to think for herself. If she says she wants to be here, then she wants to be here. That's the end of it. That's not the end of anything, Thomas said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. She doesn't know what she wants. She's been out here for weeks, isolated, probably scared. I'm standing right here, Eliza said coldly, and I'm not scared. At least not of Cade. You, on the other hand, terrify me, because you're the kind of man who thinks he owns people. Who thinks because you want something, you deserve it. You don't, and I'm not yours. You're making a fool of yourself, Thomas said, in front of all these people. Your reputation. My reputation? She laughed, bitter and sharp. You destroyed that the day you came to Bridger's Stop claiming I'd been kidnapped. You told everyone I was a victim who needed saving. You made me into a story you could control. Well, I'm done with your stories. I'm writing my own. Margaret Henderson stepped forward. The girl spoke in her piece. Time to listen, Thomas. You don't understand. I understand just fine, Margaret said. You're upset because she turned you down. You thought you could force her hand by making her look helpless. But she's not helpless. She's standing right there, telling you no. And you need to accept it. This is insane, Thomas said, looking around at the faces watching him. You're all taking her side? She's been living in sin with a— Finish that sentence, Cade said quietly, and we're going to have a problem. Thomas's mouth snapped shut. He looked at Cade, then at Eliza, then at the marshal, and the people who'd come to stand with them. The reality was sinking in. He was outnumbered, not just in bodies, but in credibility. You're all fools, he said finally. She'll regret this. When winter comes again and she's starving in the mountains, when she realizes what she's given up. I gave up nothing, Eliza said. I gained everything. Thomas stared at her, his face red with humiliation and rage. Then he turned to his men. We're leaving. Thomas, Curtis started. I said we're leaving. The men lowered their rifles slowly, exchanging glances. One by one, they mounted their horses. Thomas was the last, hauling himself into the saddle with jerky, angry movements. This isn't over, he said, pointing at Eliza. You hear me? This isn't over. Yes, Eliza said. It is. Thomas yanked his horse's head around and spurred it toward the trees. The other men followed, their exit less dramatic but no less final. Within minutes, they were gone, swallowed by the forest. The clearing fell silent. Eliza realized she was shaking. Cade lowered his rifle and moved to her side, his hand finding her back, steadying her. You all right? He asked quietly. I think so. The marshal walked over. That was well done, Miss Warren. Took courage to stand up like that. I couldn't have done it without all of you, she said, looking at the small group that had come to her defense. Why did you come? You barely know me. Samuel Porter grunted. Know you well enough. Know bullies like Greer better. Seen too many people get hurt because folks were too scared to stand up. Plus, Margaret Henderson added with a slight smile, we were curious about the man who lives in the mountains. Wanted to see if the stories were true. What stories? Cade asked. That you're dangerous, John Henderson said. That you're a killer. That you steal from traps and cabins. He looked Cade up and down. Don't look like much of a killer to me. Looks can be deceiving, Cade said evenly. Maybe. But I'm a decent judge of character, and you didn't shoot when you could have. That tells me something. Mrs. Calloway stepped forward. You've got friends in Bridger's Stop now. Not many, but some. If you need supplies, come to me. I'll sell to you fair. I appreciate that, Cade said. And Miss Warren, Mrs. Calloway looked at Eliza. If you change your mind, if you want to come back to town, you're welcome. No judgment. But if you want to stay here, that's your choice too. Just know you've got options. Eliza felt her eyes sting. Thank you, all of you. I don't know how to repay— Don't need repayment, Samuel Porter said. Just live your life. Be happy. That's enough. The group prepared to leave. The marshal lingered for a moment, pulling Cade aside. Keep your guard up, he said quietly. Greer's humiliated. Men like that don't forget. I know. You've got law on your side now, at least on paper, but paper doesn't stop bullets. Be careful. Cade nodded. The marshal tipped his hat to Eliza, then mounted his horse and led the others away. When they were gone, Eliza and Cade stood alone in the clearing. The sun was higher now, the snow sparkling in the light. Everything felt different, clearer, sharper, more real. We did it, Eliza said quietly. We actually did it. You did it, Cade corrected. You're the one who spoke up, who told them the truth. You stood beside me. Always will. She turned to face him. His eyes were dark and serious, searching hers. What happens now? She asked. That's up to you. You heard Mrs. Calloway. You've got options. You can go back to Bridger's Stop, start fresh, find work, build a life there. Or you can go to Carson Creek like you planned. Or I can stay here, she finished. Yeah, if you want. Do you want me to? Cade was quiet for a moment. Then he said, More than I've wanted anything in a long time. But it has to be your choice, Eliza. Not because you're grateful I saved your life, not because you're scared of Thomas, because it's what you actually want. She thought about Red Hollow, about Bridger's Stop, about all the places she'd tried to run to or from. Then she thought about the cabin, about the weeks she'd spent learning to survive, about the quiet comfort of sitting by the fire with someone who saw her as an equal. I want to stay, she said. Not out of fear or gratitude, because this place, with you, it feels like home, and I've never had that before. Something shifted in Cade's expression, a softness she hadn't seen before. Then stay. Just like that? Just like that. She smiled, unexpected and real. Okay. They went back into the cabin together. The rest of the day passed in a strange, peaceful calm. They worked side by side, restoring the cabin to its normal state, putting away weapons, rebuilding the fire. It felt like settling back into life after a storm. That evening, as they sat by the fire eating dinner, Eliza said, What if he does come back? Thomas? Then we deal with it. Together. You're not worried? I'm always worried, but worrying doesn't change what might happen. It just ruins what's happening now. She thought about that. Is that something your father taught you? No, that's something I learned the hard way. They were quiet for a while. Then Cade said, Can I ask you something? Always. Why did you say yes to staying? You could have had a normal life in town. Friends, community, all the things people are supposed to want. I had all that in Red Hollow, Eliza said, and I was miserable. Normal isn't what I want. I want to be with someone who respects me, who treats me like I matter, who doesn't try to make me smaller to fit his idea of what I should be. You're the first person who's ever done that. You did that yourself. I just didn't get in your way. That's what I mean. She looked at him. You make space for me to be myself. That's not nothing. That's everything. Cade reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm and solid and certain. I'm not good at this, he said quietly, at talking about feelings, at being close to people, but I want to try. With you. Then we'll figure it out together, she said. Both of us, learning as we go. He smiled, rare and genuine. Deal. They sat there as the fire burned low, hands clasped, two people who'd found each other in the middle of nowhere and decided that nowhere was exactly where they wanted to be. The next few days fell back into routine, but everything felt different now. Lighter. The threat of Thomas had lifted, at least temporarily, and Eliza felt like she could finally breathe without waiting for the other shoe to drop. She and Cade worked together with an ease that came from understanding rather than habit. He taught her to track deer through the snow, to read the sky for weather changes, to build a fire that would last through the night. She taught him to laugh more freely, to talk without weighing every word, to trust that someone could know the worst parts of him and stay anyway. One afternoon, they were working on expanding the cabin's storage when Eliza broached a subject that had been on her mind. What about your tribe? She asked. Do you ever think about going back? Cade paused, his hands stilling on the wood he was cutting. Sometimes, not often. Do you miss them? I miss what could have been, not what was. She understood that distinction. Do you think they miss you? I don't know, maybe. Maybe they're just glad I'm gone. One less person who didn't quite fit. He set down the saw. Why are you asking? Because I left people behind too. Mrs. Henley, the folks in Red Hollow, who knew my parents. I keep wondering if they think about me, if they regret how they treated me. Does it matter? Maybe not, but I think about it anyway. Cade moved to sit beside her on the half-finished storage bench. The people who matter, the ones who came to stand with you, they don't regret anything. They saw who you really are and chose to support you. That's what counts. Is that enough? A handful of people? It's more than most people get. He looked at her. I spent years trying to fit into a place that didn't want me, trying to earn belonging by becoming someone I wasn't. And I was miserable. Now I've got this cabin, this life, and you. It's not what I thought I wanted. It's better. She leaned her head against his shoulder. When did you get so wise? I'm not wise. I've just made enough mistakes to know what doesn't work. They sat there in comfortable silence until the sun started to set, painting the snow in shades of orange and pink. Eliza thought about all the choices that had led her here, leaving Red Hollow, walking into the storm, refusing to go back with Thomas. Every single one had felt terrifying at the time, but they'd brought her to this moment, this place, this person. I'm glad I walked into that storm, she said quietly. Cade's arm came around her shoulders. I'm glad I found you in it. That night, as they lay in their separate sleeping spaces, Eliza on the platform, Cade by the fire, she listened to his breathing slow and even out. She thought about propriety, about what Mrs. Henley would say if she knew Eliza was living alone in a cabin with a man. She thought about how little any of that mattered now. Cade? She whispered. Yeah? Are you asleep? Obviously not. She smiled in the darkness. What do you think happens next, after this? After what? After we've settled into this life. After Thomas gives up or forgets about me. What comes next? He was quiet for so long she thought he might have actually fallen asleep. Then he said, I think we build something that lasts. We make this cabin bigger, maybe. Learn more about surviving together. We find our own kind of community, people like the ones who came to stand with us. We make a life that's ours, not anyone else's idea of what it should be. That sounds good. Yeah? Yeah. Another long silence. Then Cade said, Eliza? I'm happy you're here. Her throat tightened. I'm happy I'm here too. She fell asleep to the sound of the fire crackling and the knowledge that for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The storm that had driven her into the mountains had been brutal and unforgiving, but it had brought her to this, to warmth, to safety, to a person who saw her clearly and chose her anyway. Not because she fit some idea of what she should be, but because of who she actually was. And that, she thought as sleep pulled her under, was worth every frozen step. 3 weeks passed in peace. The snow began to melt at the edges of the clearing, revealing patches of brown earth. Spring was still distant, but its promise hung in the air. Eliza had stopped looking over her shoulder every time she left the cabin. Thomas hadn't returned. Maybe he'd accepted defeat. Maybe he'd moved on. She should have known better. It was mid-afternoon when she heard the horse. She was outside gathering wood, her arms full of split logs, when the sound reached her, hoofbeats, single rider, coming fast through the trees. Her stomach dropped. She turned toward the cabin just as Cade emerged, rifle already in his hands. The rider burst into the clearing. Not Thomas. Someone younger, thinner, his face pale with fear or cold or both. He nearly fell off his horse when he pulled up short. Please, he gasped. Please, I need help. Cade kept the rifle level. Who are you? Danny Curtis, from Bridger's Stop. My father's one of the men who came with Thomas Greer. He looked between them frantically. Please, I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to warn you. Eliza dropped the wood and moved closer. Warn us about what? Thomas. He's coming back. Tonight. And this time he's not bringing a search party. He's bringing men who'll do whatever he says, no questions asked. Cade's jaw tightened. How many? 5, maybe 6. They're drinking at the saloon right now, working themselves up. My father tried to talk Thomas out of it, tried to tell him it was over, but Thomas... Danny's voice cracked. He's not right in the head. He keeps saying you made a fool of him, that he's going to fix it. Fix it how? Eliza asked, though she already knew the answer. He's going to burn the cabin, with or without you in it. He doesn't care anymore. He just wants you gone. The words hung in the air like smoke. Eliza felt ice in her veins. Why are you telling us this? Cade asked. If your father's with him, my father's not with him. Not this time. He told Thomas he was done, that he wanted no part of murder. That's when Thomas called him a coward and threatened him. Danny's hands were shaking on the reins. My father sent me to warn you, said it was the least he could do after almost helping Thomas the first time. When are they coming? Cade's voice was calm, but Eliza could see the tension in his shoulders. After dark. Thomas wants to catch you sleeping. Figures you won't be able to fight back if the cabin's already burning. Cade lowered the rifle slightly. You rode all this way just to warn us? My father raised me better than to stand by while murder happens, even if I am scared half to death. Danny looked at them both. You should leave. Now. While you still can. No, Cade said flatly. Are you insane? There's 6 of them and 2 of you. This is my home. I'm not running from it. Then you're going to die here, Danny said, his voice rising. Thomas has guns, torches, men who'll do anything he says. You can't fight that. Watch me. Eliza put a hand on Cade's arm. We need to think about this. I've thought about it. The answer's the same. Cade, if we run now, he'll just chase us, and the next time we won't see him coming. At least here we know the ground. We have advantages. What advantages? Against 6 armed men? He looked at her, his eyes dark and certain. The advantage of being willing to do whatever it takes to survive. They're coming here thinking we'll panic, that we'll make it easy for them. We won't. Danny's horse shifted nervously. I've done what I came to do, warned you. What you do with it is your choice. He turned the horse toward the trees, then stopped. For what it's worth, my father says he's sorry. Says he should have stood up to Thomas from the start. Tell him we don't blame him, Eliza said, and tell him thank you. Danny nodded once, then spurred his horse and disappeared into the forest. Silence fell over the clearing. Eliza turned to Cade. We can't stay here and wait to be burned alive. We're not going to be burned alive. You heard what he said? I heard. And I'm telling you, we're not running. But we're not sitting still either. We're going to prepare. Prepare how? Cade's expression was grim. The same way you prepare for any predator. You make yourself the more dangerous animal. The next few hours passed in focused intensity. Cade moved through the cabin and clearing like a man at war, checking every angle, every weakness, every potential advantage. Eliza followed his instructions without question, trusting that he knew what he was doing even when she didn't understand why. First, he dug trenches in the snow around the cabin's perimeter, shallow but wide enough to trip a man running in the dark. Then he scattered broken branches in patterns that looked random but would funnel anyone approaching toward specific points where they'd be exposed. They'll come from multiple directions, he explained, working quickly. Try to surround us. But the clearing only has 3 good approaches. We control those, we control the fight. And if they just throw torches from a distance, they could, but Thomas wants to see you dragged out. He wants to be the one who does it. That means he'll get close, and when he does, we'll be ready. Inside the cabin, he set up their defensive position. He moved the table to block one window, piled furs and supplies to create barriers, positioned weapons within easy reach. He filled buckets with snow in case fire broke out, placed them strategically around the room. If they do get a torch through, he said, we have maybe 30 seconds before the whole place goes up. That's when we go out the back window and into the trees. There's a path there. I showed you last week. You remember it? I remember. You run that path, you don't look back, you don't wait for me. You get to the creek and follow it downstream until you hit the Hendersons' land. You tell them what happened. Understand? I'm not leaving you. Eliza? No. We do this together or not at all. Cade stared at her, frustration and something else, maybe fear, maybe respect, warring on his face. Then he nodded. Together. But if I tell you to run, you run. No arguments. Same goes for you. Deal. By the time the sun started to set, they were as ready as they could be. Cade built up the fire to make it look like they were settling in for the night, then dampened it enough that it wouldn't spread if the cabin caught. They ate a cold dinner, neither of them tasting the food, both of them listening for sounds from the forest. Darkness fell fast. The temperature dropped. Eliza sat by the window with Cade's hunting knife in her hands, watching the tree line. Cade was at the other window with his rifle, his breathing slow and even. You scared? She asked quietly. Yeah, me too. Good. Scared keeps you sharp. An hour passed, then another. The moon rose, casting silver light across the snow. Nothing moved except the wind in the trees. Maybe they're not coming, Eliza whispered. Maybe Danny was wrong. Cade held up a hand for silence. He leaned forward, staring into the darkness. Then she heard it too. Voices. Low and careful, but carrying in the still air. Her heart started hammering. How many? She breathed. Can't tell yet. At least 4. The voices grew closer. Shadows moved between the trees, darker patches in the darkness. Eliza gripped the knife tighter. Her palms were sweating despite the cold. Then Thomas stepped into the moonlight at the edge of the clearing. He was carrying a torch, the flame dancing and guttering in the wind. Behind him came 5 other men, all armed, all wearing grim expressions. Cade, Thomas's voice rang out. I know you're in there. Send Eliza out and maybe we let you walk away. Cade didn't answer, just watched. I'm giving you one chance, Thomas called. One chance to do this the easy way. Still nothing. Thomas's face twisted. Fine, have it your way. He nodded to the men. They spread out, moving to surround the cabin. 2 headed left, 2 right. One stayed with Thomas in front. They moved carefully, watching for threats, but they clearly didn't expect real resistance. That was their first mistake. The man on the far left hit Cade's trench and went down hard, cursing. The man behind him stopped, confused. That moment of confusion was all Cade needed. He fired once through the window, a warning shot that kicked up snow inches from the standing man's feet. Next one won't miss, Cade shouted. The men scattered, diving for cover behind trees. Thomas dropped flat in the snow, his torch sputtering out. For a moment, the clearing was chaos, men yelling, running, trying to regroup. Then gunfire erupted. Not from Cade, from the men. They were shooting at the cabin, bullets slamming into the wood, shattering through windows. Eliza ducked behind the table as glass exploded above her head. Stay down, Cade yelled. He returned fire, measured shots that kept the men pinned but didn't waste ammunition. The shooting stopped. In the sudden silence, Eliza could hear her own breathing, harsh and fast. You can't win this, Thomas shouted from behind a tree. There's 6 of us and 2 of you. Give up now and I'll make it quick. Go to hell, Eliza screamed back before she could stop herself. Thomas laughed, ugly and raw. There she is, the ungrateful little girl who thinks she's too good for civilized society. You hear that, boys? She chose to live with a savage instead of marrying me. Shows what kind of woman she really is. Shows she's got taste, someone yelled back. Not one of Thomas's men. The voice came from behind them, from the trees. Everyone froze. Marshal Carson stepped into the clearing, rifle in his hands. Behind him came John Henderson, Samuel Porter, and 3 other men Eliza didn't recognize. They formed a line between Thomas's group and the cabin. This ends now, the marshal said, his voice carrying authority. Drop your weapons. Thomas rose slowly to his feet, fury radiating off him. This is none of your concern, Carson. Murder's always my concern, and that's what this is. Attempted murder. You and your men put down your guns and come quietly, or I arrest every one of you for arson and assault with intent to kill. On whose authority? You're a town marshal, not the law up here. I'm deputizing myself as territorial law enforcement. And these men, he gestured to the people with him, are my witnesses. You've got 5 seconds to decide how this goes. Thomas looked at the marshal, then at his own men, then at the cabin. Eliza could see him calculating, weighing his options. She held her breath. You're protecting them, Thomas said, his voice low and dangerous. You're choosing them over your own people. I'm choosing the law over a lynch mob. There's a difference. Is there? Thomas's hand moved toward his gun. Don't, the marshal warned. Don't make me shoot you, Thomas. You won't. You don't have the stones. The marshal's rifle came up to his shoulder. Try me. Time seemed to stop. Thomas's hand hovered over his gun. The men behind him shifted nervously. No one spoke. Then one of Thomas's men, a younger guy, barely 20, dropped his rifle in the snow. I'm out, he said, his voice shaking. I signed up for a rescue, not a murder. I'm out. Another man followed suit, then a third. Thomas whirled on them. You cowards, you weak, spineless. We're done, Thomas, one of them said. This has gone far enough. She made her choice. Let it go. Let it go. Thomas's voice rose to a shout. She humiliated me. She made me a laughingstock. And you want me to just let it go? Yes, the marshal said firmly. That's exactly what we want you to do. Go home, Thomas. Sleep it off. Move on with your life. My life? Thomas laughed, high and brittle. What life? Everyone in town looks at me like I'm a fool. Women won't talk to me. Men make jokes behind my back. She ruined me. You ruined yourself, Eliza said, stepping into the doorway of the cabin. Cade tried to pull her back, but she shrugged him off. You ruined yourself the moment you decided I was something you could own instead of someone you could love. You did this, Thomas. Not me. Thomas stared at her across the clearing. In the moonlight, his face looked hollow, haunted. I would have given you everything. You would have taken everything. There's a difference. You'll regret this. His voice was quiet now, almost sad. When you're alone and forgotten in these mountains, you'll wish you'd chosen differently. No, Eliza said. I won't, because I'm not alone. And I didn't choose these mountains. I chose freedom. I chose myself. And that's something you'll never understand. Thomas's shoulders sagged. The fight seemed to drain out of him all at once, leaving behind something smaller and more pathetic. He looked at his remaining men, the two who hadn't dropped their weapons. They stood there, uncomfortable, clearly wanting to be anywhere else. Let's go, Thomas said finally. There's nothing here worth dying for. He turned and walked toward the trees. His men followed. Within minutes, they disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind only footprints in the snow and the echo of gunshots. The marshal lowered his rifle. Everyone all right? Cade emerged from the cabin, scanning the clearing. We're fine, thanks to you. Don't thank me yet. Thomas might be leaving now, but he's not done. Men like that don't let go easy. I know. Samuel Porter walked over, his face grave. We'll keep an eye on him, make sure he doesn't come back with reinforcements, but you two should be careful, real careful. We will be, Eliza said. The men prepared to leave. John Henderson paused at the edge of the clearing. For what it's worth, he said, you handled yourself well tonight, Miss Warren. Took guts to stand up like that. I've had good teachers, she said, glancing at Cade. Henderson smiled slightly. I reckon you have. He tipped his hat and followed the others into the trees. When they were alone again, Eliza and Cade stood in the clearing, surveying the damage. Bullet holes peppered the cabin's front wall. The windows were shattered. Snow was piled everywhere from the men's movements. Well, Eliza said, that could have gone worse. Cade looked at her, then started laughing. It was a rough sound, rusty from disuse, but genuine. Eliza found herself laughing too, the tension of the last few hours breaking like a fever. They went inside and assessed the damage. The table had taken several bullets but was still intact. The furs would need patching. The windows would need to be covered until they could replace the glass. Assuming glass could even be gotten in these mountains. We'll manage, Cade said, already pulling out supplies to board up the windows. We've managed everything else. They worked through the night, making the cabin secure again. By dawn, the worst of the damage was repaired. Exhausted, they collapsed on the sleeping platform together, too tired to maintain the polite distance they'd been keeping. Eliza's head ended up on Cade's shoulder. His arm came around her. Neither of them commented on it. He's going to come back, she said quietly. Isn't he? Maybe. Probably. Does that scare you? Everything scares me, but I'm still here. She closed her eyes. Me too. They slept until midday, then rose and went about the business of living, checking traps, gathering wood, preparing food. The routine was comforting after the violence of the night before. 3 days passed, then a week. No sign of Thomas. But Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there somewhere, planning, waiting. She was right. It happened on a cold morning when Cade had gone to check the northern traps, and Eliza was alone at the cabin. She was working on repairing a torn hide when she heard a horse approaching. She grabbed the rifle and moved to the window, her heart racing. But it wasn't Thomas who emerged from the trees. It was a woman, older, gray-haired, riding a sturdy mare. She pulled up at the edge of the clearing and dismounted slowly, moving like someone whose body hurt. Eliza kept the rifle trained on her. Who are you? My name's Catherine Greer, the woman said. Her voice was tired. I'm Thomas's mother. Eliza's stomach clenched. What do you want? To talk. Just talk. Can I come closer? Why should I trust you? You shouldn't, but I'm an old woman with arthritis and no weapon. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to apologize. That was unexpected. Eliza lowered the rifle slightly. Apologize for what? For my son. For what he's become. For what he tried to do to you. Catherine took a few steps forward, her hands visible and empty. Can I sit? My knees don't work like they used to. Eliza gestured to a stump near the cabin's edge. Catherine sat with a grateful sigh. I knew you as a child, Catherine said. Knew your parents. They were good people. Raised you to be strong, independent. Your father used to say you had fire in you that no one could put out. He was right. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to understand that Thomas wasn't always like this. When he was young, he was kind, thoughtful. But his father, my husband, was a hard man. Cruel in ways that didn't leave marks but left scars all the same. He taught Thomas that strength meant control, that love meant ownership, and I was too weak to stop it. Eliza felt her anger soften slightly, replaced by something more complicated. That doesn't excuse what he did. No, it doesn't, but it explains it, and I thought you deserved an explanation. Catherine looked up at her. He's planning something. I don't know what. He won't tell me, but I see it in his eyes. That same look his father used to get before he did something terrible. I came to warn you. Warn me about what? About whatever he's planning. He's been to Carson Creek twice in the last week, hiring men, gathering supplies. He's not coming alone this time, and he's not coming with torches. He's coming with something worse. Eliza felt ice spread through her chest. When? I don't know. Soon, I think. He's been drinking more, sleeping less, acting like a man who's made up his mind. Catherine stood slowly. I know it's not my place to ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least try to warn you. Why now? Why not stop him before it got this far? I tried. I've been trying for months, but he's a grown man and I'm just an old woman who failed him a long time ago. I can't stop him. But maybe you can, or maybe you can at least be ready when he comes. She walked back to her horse and mounted with difficulty. Before she left, she turned back. Your parents would be proud of you, she said. Standing up for yourself the way you have. That takes more courage than most people have in their whole lives. Then she rode away, leaving Eliza standing alone in the clearing with a rifle in her hands and fear gnawing at her insides. When Cade returned an hour later, she told him everything. He listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with each detail. She's right, he said when she finished. He's planning something big, something final. What do we do? We could leave, go deeper into the mountains, somewhere he can't find us. For how long? The rest of our lives? If that's what it takes. Eliza shook her head. I'm tired of running. I'm tired of being afraid. We stand and fight, or we leave forever. Those are the only options. Fighting might mean dying. So does running. At least if we fight, we die on our own terms. Cade studied her face. Whatever he saw there made him nod slowly. All right. Then we prepare for war. The next 2 weeks were brutal. They fortified the cabin, digging deeper trenches, building barriers, stockpiling ammunition. Cade taught Eliza to shoot properly, not just well enough to scare someone, but well enough to hit them if necessary. She practiced until her shoulders ached and her hands were raw. They also made trips to Bridger's Stop, meeting with the marshal and their small group of allies. Samuel Porter donated an old rifle. John Henderson brought ammunition. Mrs. Calloway provided food and first aid supplies. You're preparing for a siege, the marshal observed, looking at their stockpile. Better to have it and not need it, Cade said. I wish I could give you more help, more men. You've done enough, more than enough. The marshal looked uncomfortable. There's talk in town about Thomas hiring gunmen from Carson Creek, professional types. If that's true, we'll handle it. Cade, we'll handle it, Cade repeated, his voice harder. One way or another. They returned to the cabin and continued preparing. Days blurred into nights. Every sound made them jump. Every shadow looked like an enemy. Then, on a cold evening 3 weeks after Catherine's visit, it happened. Eliza was inside making dinner when Cade called from the doorway. His voice was tight. They're here. She dropped the pan and grabbed her rifle. Outside, the clearing was filling with men. Not 6 this time, 15, maybe 20. They moved with military precision, spreading out, taking positions behind trees and rocks. Thomas stood in the center, flanked by two hard-looking men who had to be the hired guns. He looked different, thinner, wilder, his eyes burning with something beyond reason. "Last chance!" he shouted toward the cabin. "Or come out now or we burn you out. Your choice." Cade moved beside Eliza, his face grim. "This is it." "This is it," she agreed. They stepped out onto the porch together, weapons ready. Thomas saw them and smiled, but there was no humor in it. "You should have left when you had the chance," he said. "We're not leaving," Eliza replied. "This is our home." "Then it's your grave." He raised his hand to signal his men, but before he could drop it, a shot rang out from the forest. Everyone froze. Then another shot, and another. From 3 different directions, men stepped out of the trees behind Thomas's group, the marshal, John Henderson, Samuel Porter, and at least a dozen others. They formed a wall, rifles raised, faces set. "It's over, Thomas," the marshal called. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. Stand down." Thomas turned slowly, taking in the situation. For a moment his face was blank with shock. Then it twisted into rage so pure it was almost inhuman. "No!" he screamed. "No, she's mine. She belongs to me." "She belongs to herself," the marshal said, "and you need to accept that." Thomas pulled his gun. The movement was fast, desperate. He aimed at Eliza. Everything happened at once. Cade moved in front of her, his body a shield. The marshal fired, his bullet catching Thomas in the shoulder. Thomas spun, his own shot going wild, hitting nothing but air. He dropped to his knees, still clutching his gun, still trying to aim. Then Eliza was moving, running across the clearing. She reached Thomas before anyone could stop her, kicked the gun from his hand, and stood over him. "It's over," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You lost. Not because anyone beat you, because you beat yourself." Thomas looked up at her, blood spreading across his shirt, his face pale and confused. "I loved you." "No," she said. "You wanted to own me. There's a difference, and you never learned it." He collapsed into the snow, unconscious. The hired guns dropped their weapons, hands raised. Thomas's other men did the same, clearly wanting no part of whatever this had become. The marshal moved through the clearing, organizing his people to gather weapons and tend to Thomas's wound. Cade pulled Eliza back toward the cabin, checking her for injuries she didn't have. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his hands shaking as they ran over her arms, her shoulders. "He could have shot you." "But he didn't. It's over, Cade. It's really over." And looking at the scene in the clearing, Thomas incapacitated, his men surrendering, their allies standing strong, she believed it. The marshal and his men took Thomas away that night, loading him onto a wagon for the journey back to Bridger's Stop. His shoulder wound wasn't fatal, but it would keep him in bed for weeks. The hired guns scattered, taking their money and disappearing into the territories where lawmen didn't ask too many questions. The rest of Thomas's men went home, shamefaced and quiet, finally understanding what they'd almost been part of. Before the marshal left, he pulled Eliza aside. "There'll be a hearing," he said, "in about 2 weeks, once Thomas is well enough to stand trial. You'll need to testify." Her stomach clenched. "Testify to what?" "Everything. The harassment, the threats, tonight's attack. We've got witnesses, but your testimony will be crucial. Thomas needs to answer for what he's done." "Will it make a difference? Will people believe me?" "Enough people will. You've got allies now, Eliza, more than you think, but you need to show up and tell the truth. Can you do that?" She thought about standing in front of a room full of people, exposing everything that had happened, reliving the fear and the anger. Then she thought about what would happen if she didn't. Thomas walking free, finding new ways to hurt her, teaching other men that this behavior had no consequences. "I'll be there," she said. The marshal nodded. "Good. And Miss Warren? What you did tonight, standing up to him like that took real courage. Don't let anyone tell you different." After they left, Eliza and Cade stood in the clearing watching the last of the torches disappear into the trees. The snow was trampled and dirty, marked with boot prints and blood stains. The cabin behind them was riddled with bullet holes, but they were alive, and they were together. "Come on," Cade said quietly. "Let's go inside." They spent the next hour cleaning up, boarding windows that had been shot out, sweeping broken glass and spent shells. It was mindless work, but it gave them something to do with their hands while their minds tried to process everything that had happened. Finally, when there was nothing left to clean, they sat by the fire. Eliza's hands were shaking. Now that the danger had passed, the reality of it was sinking in. How close they'd come to dying, how easily it could have gone the other way. Hey. Cade's hand covered hers, warm and steady. We're okay. I know, her voice caught. When he pointed that gun at me, all I could think was that you were going to get hurt trying to protect me, and I couldn't stand it. That's why I did it, because I couldn't stand the thought of you getting hurt. She looked at him, really looked at him. His face was tired, streaked with dirt and sweat, a cut above his eyebrow from flying debris. He looked like he'd been through a war. He looked beautiful. I love you, she said. The words came out before she could stop them, raw and unplanned. Cade went very still. Eliza, I know it's too soon. I know we haven't talked about it, but I almost died tonight without telling you, and I couldn't live with that. So I'm telling you now. I love you. Not because you saved my life, not because I'm grateful, but because you see me, really see me. And that's something I've never had before. He was quiet for so long she thought she'd made a terrible mistake. Then he pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. I love you too, he said quietly. I think I have since the moment you told Thomas you'd rather die free than live in a cage. You're the bravest person I've ever met, and I don't want to live in a world where you're not in it. She kissed him then, and it wasn't perfect or smooth. Their lips were chapped from the cold, their hands were shaking, and they both tasted like fear and smoke. But it was real, and that made it everything. They held each other by the fire until the flames burned low and exhaustion finally pulled them under. They fell asleep tangled together on the sleeping platform, too tired to care about propriety or what anyone would think. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange limbo. They repaired the cabin, replacing what could be replaced and patching what couldn't. People from Bridger's stop started showing up, not to cause trouble, but to help. John Henderson brought lumber. Samuel Porter brought nails and tools. Mrs. Calloway brought food and news from town. Thomas is recovering, she told them one afternoon, sitting in the cabin drinking coffee. But he's not the same. The injury did something to him, or maybe it was finally facing consequences. Either way, he's quieter now. Broken, almost. Good, Eliza said, and meant it. Not because she wanted him to suffer, but because she wanted him to understand, to feel, even for a moment, what it was like to have your choices taken away. There's talk that his mother is sending him east, Mrs. Calloway continued, to family in Philadelphia. Get him away from here. Let him start over somewhere he doesn't have a reputation. Will he go? Don't know, but Catherine's determined. She feels responsible for how he turned out. Figures maybe a fresh start will help him become someone better. Eliza thought about that, about second chances, about whether people could really change. She wanted to believe they could. But she also knew that change only happened when someone decided they wanted to be different. Thomas would have to make that choice himself. No one could make it for him. The day of the hearing arrived cold and clear. Eliza dressed in her best clothes, which wasn't saying much, just a clean dress Mrs. Calloway had given her and her mother's silver hairbrush in her hair. Cade wore his buckskin and a clean shirt, his hair tied back, his face serious. They rode into Bridger's stop together, accompanied by the marshal and several of their allies. The town was buzzing with anticipation. Everyone knew about the hearing, everyone had an opinion. The hearing was held in the town hall, a drafty building with a high ceiling and rows of benches. It was packed. Eliza recognized some faces, Mrs. Calloway, the Hendersons, Samuel Porter. But there were plenty of strangers too, people from surrounding towns who'd heard about the case and wanted to see justice done, or wanted to see a spectacle. She couldn't always tell which. Thomas sat at the front with his lawyer, a nervous-looking man from Carson Creek. Thomas's arm was in a sling, his face pale. When Eliza walked in, he looked at her once, then looked away. There was no fight left in his eyes, just emptiness. The judge was an older man named Winters, brought in from the territorial capital to ensure impartiality. He called the hearing to order and outlined the charges: harassment, assault, attempted arson, conspiracy to commit murder. The list was long and damning. The marshal testified first, describing Thomas's escalating behavior, The multiple warnings that had been ignored, the final attack on the cabin. Then came witnesses, Danny Curtis, who'd ridden out to warn them, Mrs. Calloway, who testified about Thomas's behavior in Bridger's stop, John Henderson, who described what he'd seen the night of the attack. Then it was Eliza's turn. She walked to the front of the room with her heart hammering. Every eye was on her. She could feel the weight of their attention, their judgment, their curiosity. "Miss Warren," Judge Winters said, his voice kind but firm, "please tell us, in your own words, what happened between you and Mr. Greer." She took a breath. Then she told them everything, about the marriage proposals she'd turned down, about the public humiliation at the train depot, about Mrs. Henley's cruel words and Thomas showing up at the hotel in the storm, about walking into the blizzard because it seemed safer than staying within his reach. She told them about Cade finding her, about learning to survive, about choosing to stay. She told them about Thomas coming to the cabin with 8 men, claiming she'd been kidnapped, about the standoff, the threats, the nights lying awake wondering when he'd come back. And she told them about the final attack, the hired guns, the overwhelming force, the moment Thomas had pointed a gun at her and Cade had stepped between them. By the time she finished, her voice was hoarse. The room was silent. "Miss Warren," the judge said, "did Mr. Greer ever physically harm you?" "He grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. He threatened me multiple times, and he tried to burn down a cabin while I was inside it. Does that count as harm?" "Yes, Miss Warren, it does." Judge Winters made a note in his ledger. "One more question. At any point, did you ever indicate to Mr. Greer that his attention was welcome?" "Never. I turned him down 3 times before I left Red Hollow. I rejected him again at the hotel. I made it clear, repeatedly, that I wanted nothing to do with him. He chose not to hear it." "Thank you, Miss Warren. You may step down." She returned to her seat next to Cade, her legs shaking. He took her hand and squeezed it. Across the room, she saw Thomas staring at the floor, his face unreadable. Thomas's lawyer called him to testify. He stood slowly, moving like a man much older than his years. His voice when he spoke was quiet, defeated. "I thought I was helping her," he said. "I thought she was confused, that she didn't know what she wanted. I thought if I could just make her see reason, she'd understand that marrying me was the right choice." "And when she repeatedly told you she didn't want to marry you?" the judge asked. "I didn't believe her. I thought—" He stopped, his jaw working. "I thought I knew better. I thought I knew what was best for her." "And the attack on the cabin?" Thomas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I wasn't thinking straight. I was angry, humiliated. I wanted her to understand what she'd done to me, what she'd taken from me." "What she'd taken from you," Judge Winters repeated, his voice flat. "You mean her refusal to marry you?" "Yes. Mr. Greer, do you understand that a woman's refusal is not theft, that she took nothing from you because she was never yours to begin with?" Thomas looked up, and for the first time Eliza saw something in his face that might have been understanding, or might have been the beginning of it. "I'm starting to," he said quietly. The judge deliberated for less than an hour. When he returned, his expression was grave. "Thomas Greer, you are found guilty of harassment, assault, and attempted arson. You are sentenced to 3 years in the territorial prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months pending good behavior." He paused. "I'm also issuing a permanent restraining order. You are not to come within 50 miles of Miss Eliza Warren or Mr. Cade for the rest of your natural life. If you violate this order, you will serve the remainder of your sentence with no possibility of parole. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Thomas said. "Do you have anything you'd like to say to Miss Warren?" Thomas turned slowly, looking at Eliza for the first time since the hearing began. Their eyes met across the crowded room. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was barely audible. "I'm sorry for everything. You deserved better. You deserved to be heard. And I was too selfish to listen. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough to make up for what he'd put her through. But it was something, a recognition, however small, that he'd been wrong." Eliza didn't say anything. She just nodded once, an acknowledgement that she'd heard him. That's all she owed him, nothing more. They took Thomas away in chains. Catherine Greer was waiting outside the town hall, her face wet with tears. She tried to approach Eliza, but Eliza shook her head. "Not today. Maybe not ever. Some apologies couldn't be accepted, no matter how sincere they were. After the hearing, there was a gathering at Mrs. Calloway's hotel. People wanted to celebrate, to toast Eliza's courage, to congratulate her on her victory. But Eliza didn't feel victorious. She just felt tired, tired and ready to go home. She found Cade outside, standing in the cold, watching the sun set over the mountains. "You all right?" she asked. "Should be asking you that." "I'm okay. Or I will be." She moved beside him, their shoulders touching. "Can we leave tomorrow? I just want to go back to the cabin. To our life." "Yeah, we can leave tomorrow." They spent one more night in Bridger's Stop, sleeping in a real bed at Mrs. Calloway's hotel. In the morning, they packed up their supplies and said their goodbyes. The marshal shook Cade's hand. Mrs. Calloway hugged Eliza tight. Samuel Porter just nodded. His weathered face creased in approval. "You're welcome here any time," Margaret Henderson said. "Both of you. You've got friends in this town now." It was strange to hear that. To have friends, to belong somewhere, to be part of a community. Eliza had spent so long feeling like she didn't fit anywhere. Now she fit in two places, Bridger's Stop, which had proven itself when it mattered, and the cabin in the mountains, where she'd found something she'd never expected to find. The ride back to the cabin took most of the day. By the time they arrived, the sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of orange and gold. The clearing looked different somehow, smaller maybe, or just more ordinary now that it wasn't a battlefield. They went inside and started a fire. Cade made dinner while Eliza unpacked their supplies. It felt almost absurdly normal, this domestic routine, after everything they'd been through. "What happens now?" she asked over dinner. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what do we do? Just go back to how things were? Pretend none of that happened?" Cade set down his fork. "I don't think we can pretend it didn't happen, but we can decide what it means, whether it defines us or whether we define it. I don't want to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next threat." "Then we don't. We live. We build. We make this place into something that's ours, not just a refuge from something else." She liked that idea. A life built on choice rather than escape. A future created deliberately, not stumbled into. "Tell me what that looks like," she said. "This life we're building." Cade thought for a moment. "We expand the cabin, make it bigger, more permanent. We build a second room, maybe a loft. We stock up properly for next winter so we're not always scrambling. We learn more skills. Maybe I teach you to tan hides properly, and you teach me to read better. We make trips to Bridger's Stop when we need supplies or company. We help our neighbors when they need it, and let them help us. We live." Just live? Just live. Is that not enough? It was enough. It was more than enough. Over the next few months, that's exactly what they did. They expanded the cabin, working side by side to add a second room and reinforce the walls. Cade taught Eliza everything he knew about surviving in the mountains. Not just surviving, but thriving. How to preserve meat for months, how to predict weather patterns, how to find water even in the driest seasons. In turn, Eliza taught Cade to read. They'd acquired a few books on one of their trips to Bridger's Stop, and she spent evenings by the fire helping him sound out words, watching his face light up as sentences started to make sense. He was a quick learner, hungry for knowledge he'd never had access to before. They also started making regular trips to Bridger's Stop, not just for supplies but for community. They attended town meetings. They helped the Hendersons with their harvest. They became part of the social fabric of the place, no longer outsiders, but neighbors. It wasn't always easy. Some people in Bridger's Stop still looked at them sideways, an unmarried couple living together, a white woman with a native man. But most people had moved past it, or at least learned to keep their opinions to themselves. And the ones who mattered, the marshal, Mrs. Calloway, the families who'd stood with them, those people treated them with respect. Spring came, then summer. The snow melted, revealing wildflowers and new growth. Eliza planted a garden near the cabin, something she'd never thought to do during those desperate early months. Now she had time to think beyond immediate survival, time to plan, to dream, to build something lasting. One warm evening in June, they were sitting outside watching the sunset when Cade said, "Marry me." Eliza looked at him, startled. "What?" "Marry me. Properly. With the marshal officiating, in front of people. I know we don't need a ceremony to make this real, but I want—" He stopped, searching for words. I want everyone to know that you chose this, that you chose me, not because you had to, but because you wanted to." Her throat tightened. "You know what people will say." "I don't care what people say. I care what you say." She thought about what marriage had meant in Red Hollow, a prison, a loss of self, a surrender of autonomy, and about what it could mean here, a public declaration of partnership, a legal protection, a celebration of choice. "Yes," she said, "but I have conditions." Cade raised an eyebrow. "Conditions?" "I keep my name. We own everything equally, the cabin, the land, all of it. And if I ever want to leave, for any reason, you don't try to stop me." "You planning on leaving?" "No. But I need to know I could. That I'm staying because I choose to every single day." He nodded slowly. "Fair. I agree to all of it." "Then, yes, I'll marry you." They were married 4 weeks later in Bridger's Stop, in a simple ceremony at the town hall. Mrs. Calloway stood up as Eliza's witness. Samuel Porter stood for Cade. The marshal officiated, reading from a worn book of legal proceedings, his voice carrying weight and authority. "Do you, Eliza Warren, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in partnership and equality for as long as you both shall choose?" "I do." "And do you, Cade, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in partnership and equality for as long as you both shall choose?" "I do." "Then by the power vested in me by the territorial government, I pronounce you husband and wife." They kissed, and the small gathering applauded. It wasn't a fancy wedding. There were no flowers, no elaborate dress, no reception with dancing. But it was theirs, and that made it perfect. That night, they returned to the cabin as husband and wife. Nothing had really changed. They'd been committed to each other long before any ceremony made it official. But something felt different anyway. Settled, permanent. "Happy?" Cade asked as they lay in bed, the summer night warm and quiet around them. "Yeah," Eliza said. "I really am." Summer gave way to fall. The leaves turned gold and red, then fell, carpeting the forest floor. Eliza and Cade prepared for winter, stocking the cabin with supplies, reinforcing the walls, making sure they had enough wood to last until spring. One afternoon in late October, they had visitors. Not from Bridger's Stop, but from the mountains. 3 people on horseback, 2 men and a woman, all dressed in buckskin and wool. They stopped at the edge of the clearing and waited, not approaching until Cade stepped out to greet them. Eliza watched from the doorway as Cade spoke with them in a language she didn't understand. His face was guarded, but not hostile. After a few minutes, he turned and called to her. "Eliza, come here." She walked out slowly. Up close, she could see that the visitors were native. Crow, she thought, though she wasn't certain. The woman was about Eliza's age, with sharp eyes and a serious expression. The 2 men were older, weathered by years of mountain living. "This is my cousin, Nayeli," Cade said, gesturing to the woman. "And these are her brothers, Tahitan and Chayton. They're from my tribe." Eliza's stomach clenched. "Are you here to bring him back?" Nayeli smiled slightly. "No, we're here to see if he's alive, and to meet the woman who convinced him to stay in one place for more than a season." "I didn't convince him to do anything," Eliza said carefully. "He makes his own choices." "Good answer." Nayeli dismounted and walked closer, studying Eliza with frank curiosity. "Cade told us he'd found someone. We didn't believe him. He's never stayed anywhere long enough to find anything." "People change," Cade said. "Apparently." Nayeli looked between them. "Are we welcome here? We don't want to intrude, but we've come a long way." Cade looked at Eliza. She nodded. "You're welcome," he said. "Stay as long as you like." They did stay, 3 days, during which Eliza learned more about Cade's past than he'd told her in all their months together. She learned that he'd left the tribe 7 years ago, after his father died and the pressure to prove himself had become unbearable. She learned that Nayeli had been his closest friend growing up, the one person who'd never questioned his belonging. "I tried to convince him to stay," Nayeli told Eliza one evening while the men were outside. "Told him it would get better, that people would accept him eventually, but he was done waiting for acceptance." "Do you blame him?" "No. I understand why he left. I just missed him." She looked at Eliza. "He seems happy now, happier than I've ever seen him." "He is happy. We both are." "Good." That's all any of us can hope for, to find a place where we're happy. Doesn't matter if that place is with a tribe or in a cabin in the mountains. What matters is the choosing. When Nayeli and her brothers left, they extended an invitation. Come visit sometime, Nayeli said. Both of you. The tribe isn't perfect, but it's better than it was. And I think people would surprise you. They're more accepting than Cade remembers. Maybe, Cade said. Someday, after they left, Eliza asked him if he meant it. About visiting? Yeah, he thought for a moment. Maybe, not yet, but maybe someday. I left because I needed to find out who I was without them. Now that I know, maybe I can go back without losing myself. And who are you? She asked, teasing slightly. I'm Cade. I'm a hunter, a builder, a husband. I'm someone who lives between worlds and found a way to make that work. I'm someone who's happy. He pulled her close. I'm yours. And I'm yours, she said, but also my own. Is that too complicated? No, that's perfect. Winter came again, but it was different this year. They were prepared. They had food, fuel, supplies. They had each other. When the snow fell, they didn't see it as a threat, but as a natural part of the cycle. When the cold set in, they bundled up and kept working, kept living, kept choosing this life day after day. On a night in January, during one of the worst storms of the season, they sat by the fire and talked about the future. What do you want? Cade asked. 5 years from now, 10 years from now. What does that life look like? Eliza thought about it. I want this cabin to still be standing. I want to look at you across the table and still feel lucky that you're here. I want to have helped build something in Bridger's Stop, maybe a school or a meeting hall where people can gather. I want to know that we made a difference, that our lives mattered beyond just our own survival. We could have children, Cade said carefully. If you wanted. She'd thought about it. Maybe, someday, but not yet. I'm not ready to be responsible for another life when I'm still figuring out my own. Is that selfish? No, that's honest. And I'd rather you be honest than do something you're not ready for just because it's expected. What about you? What do you want? I want to keep learning, keep building. I want to master skills I don't have yet, maybe ironwork or advanced carpentry. I want to write things down, stories and knowledge, so they don't disappear. And I want to grow old with you, watching the seasons change, seeing what comes next. That sounds good, she said. All of it sounds good. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Eliza said, Do you ever think about Thomas? About what happened to him? Sometimes. Do you? Yeah, I heard from Mrs. Calloway that he did go to Philadelphia. His mother sent him to live with an uncle who runs a printing business. Apparently he's working there now, learning a trade. Think he'll change? I don't know. I hope so. Not for my sake, but for his. And for whoever he meets next. The world doesn't need more men who think love means ownership. No, Kate agreed. It doesn't. Another pause. Then Eliza said, I've been thinking about something, about why what we have works when so many other relationships don't. And I think it's because we both came to this with nothing to prove. We weren't trying to fit each other into some idea of what we should be. We just existed together and built something from that. You think that's unusual? I think it's rare. Most people start with expectations, with ideas of what a man should be, what a woman should be, what a marriage should look like. We started with nothing but survival, and somehow that gave us freedom to become whatever we wanted. Cade considered that. You might be right. I never thought I'd want a partner, never thought I'd be able to trust someone enough to share my life with them. But you never tried to change me. You just accepted me, worked with me. That made all the difference. Same for me. You never tried to make me smaller. You gave me space to grow, to become whoever I needed to be. That's not something I ever had before. They looked at each other across the firelight, two people who'd found each other by accident and chosen each other deliberately. Two people who understood that love wasn't about possession or completion, but about partnership and choice. To us, Cade said, raising an imaginary glass. To us, Eliza echoed, and to everyone who has the courage to choose themselves first. Winter eventually gave way to spring, as it always did. The snow melted, the ice broke, and life returned to the mountains. Eliza and Cade emerged from their cabin into a world renewed, ready for another season of work and growth and living. Years passed. The cabin grew. So did their community. More people settled in the mountains around them, families looking for land, individuals seeking solitude, outcasts like Cade who'd found acceptance nowhere else. They formed a loose network of neighbors, helping each other through hard times, celebrating together during good ones. Eliza and Cade became known as the couple who'd stood up to tyranny, who'd proven that love built on respect was stronger than love built on possession. People came to them for advice, for mediation in disputes, for examples of how to live differently. They didn't always have the answers. They argued sometimes, disagreed about money or work, or how to handle their growing responsibilities to the community. But they always came back to the same foundation: mutual respect, honest communication, and the understanding that they were partners, not owner and owned. On their 5th anniversary, they stood in the clearing outside the cabin and looked at what they'd built. The cabin had doubled in size. The garden had expanded to include vegetables, herbs, and even a few fruit trees they were carefully nurturing. There were outbuildings now: a smokehouse, a workshop, a small stable for the 2 horses they'd acquired. "Remember when this was just a shelter and a fire pit?" Eliza asked. "Hard to forget. We've come a long way." "We have." She took his hand. "Do you ever regret it? Choosing this life instead of something easier?" "Never. You?" "Not once." They stood there as the sun set, watching the light fade from gold to orange to purple. 5 years ago, Eliza had been a girl running from a life that suffocated her. Now she was a woman who'd built a life that sustained her. 5 years ago, Cade had been a man alone in the wilderness. Now he was a husband, a neighbor, a member of a community. Neither of them was perfect. They still made mistakes, still struggled, still had days when everything felt too hard. But they'd learned something that many people never learned: that imperfection wasn't failure, that struggling didn't mean you were doing it wrong, that hard days were just part of the price you paid for a life worth living. "You know what I think?" Eliza said. "What?" "I think the story everyone tells about us is wrong. They make it sound like you saved me, like I was helpless until you came along. I hate that version too. The truth is, we saved each other. You gave me shelter when I was dying. I gave you a reason to stay in one place. We both brought something the other needed. That's not rescue, that's partnership." "You're right, but people like simple stories. Hero saves damsel, everyone lives happily ever after. Except that's not how it works. We're not living happily ever after. We're living happily right now, in this moment, and we'll have to choose to keep doing it tomorrow. And the day after that. And the day after that. There's no ever after. There's just the daily choice to keep choosing each other." Cade smiled. "That's a much harder story to tell. But it's the true one. And truth matters more than simplicity." They went inside as night fell, lighting lamps and starting dinner. Through the window, they could see their neighbors' lights beginning to glow: the Henderson place to the south, Samuel Porter's cabin to the east, a new family's homestead to the north. They were part of something now, woven into a fabric of community and mutual support. After dinner, they sat by the fire. Cade was reading from one of their books, sounding out words with increasing confidence. Eliza was working on a quilt, piecing together scraps of fabric into something beautiful and useful. "Listen to this," Cade said, reading aloud. "The truth is, we are all wildcrafted, each of us shaped by the wilderness we've survived, bearing the scars and strengths of our particular storms." "That's beautiful. Where's it from?" "Book of essays Mrs. Calloway gave us last time we were in town. Woman named Everett wrote it. She was a frontierswoman, lived alone for years before she married." "Sounds familiar," Eliza said with a smile. "Thought you'd appreciate it." He kept reading silently for a moment, then said, "You ever think about writing our story down? Not the fairy tale version, but the real one?" "Sometimes, but I'm not sure I could do it justice. How do you capture something this complicated in words? The same way we lived it. Honestly, imperfectly, with all the messy parts included." She thought about that. About writing down the truth of what had happened. Not just the dramatic confrontations and narrow escapes, but the quiet moments in between. The learning, the growing, the daily choice to keep building something worth having. "Maybe someday," she said. "When we're older and can see it all in perspective." Or maybe we just live it and let someone else worry about writing it down. That works too. They sat in comfortable silence, each absorbed in their own tasks but aware of each other's presence. This, Eliza thought, was what happiness looked like. Not fireworks and grand gestures, but quiet contentment. The knowledge that you were exactly where you wanted to be with exactly who you wanted to be with. Another year passed, then another. They took Nayeli up on her invitation and visited Cade's tribe. It was awkward at first. People remembered him, remembered the reasons he'd left. But Nayeli had been right. Things had changed. The elders who'd made his life difficult had died or stepped down. Younger people had taken their places, people who cared less about blood quantum and more about character. They stayed for 2 weeks, long enough for Cade to reconnect with people he'd grown up with, for Eliza to understand the culture that had shaped him, long enough for both of them to realize that Cade had been right to leave but might be ready to visit again. "I don't belong here," he said on their last night, sitting outside Nayeli's dwelling under a blanket of stars. "But I'm not as separate from it as I thought. Maybe I can have both, my life in the mountains and connection to my people. Maybe it doesn't have to be all or nothing." "I think you're right," Eliza said, "and I think that's a lesson more people need to learn. That you can honor where you came from without being bound by it. That leaving doesn't mean betrayal, and returning doesn't mean surrender." They rode back to their cabin with a deeper sense of peace. Cade had made his peace with his past. Eliza had long since made peace with hers. Now they could focus fully on their future. That future brought changes. They built a second cabin on their land and offered it to a young couple from Bridger's Stop who needed a fresh start. They helped establish a trading post halfway between their settlement and town, making it easier for mountain folk to get supplies without the long journey. They taught classes, Cade on wilderness survival, Eliza on reading and writing, for anyone who wanted to learn. They also quietly helped other women who found themselves in situations like Eliza's had been. Women running from men who thought they owned them. Women who needed a safe place to figure out their next move. The second cabin became a refuge, a place where women could stay until they got their feet under them. "We're building something bigger than just our lives," Eliza said one day, watching a young woman practice shooting with a rifle they'd lent her. "We're building a model for how things could be different." "Think it'll last?" Cade asked. "I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But at least we tried. At least we showed people that there's another way. That's all any of us can do. Try. And hope the trying makes a difference." On their 10th anniversary, they threw a party. Not a fancy affair, but a gathering of everyone who'd been part of their story. Mrs. Calloway, the Marshall, the Hendersons, Samuel Porter, Nayeli and her brothers, families from the mountain settlement, people from Bridger's Stop. They roasted a deer, built a bonfire, told stories late into the night. At one point, Samuel Porter raised his cup and called for attention. 10 years ago, he said, his voice carrying across the clearing, most of us didn't know Eliza Warren or Cade, but we watched them stand up to tyranny. We watched them choose each other when the world said they shouldn't, and we watched them build something that matters, not just a home, but a community, a place where people can be themselves without fear. He paused, looking around at the gathered faces. "We live in hard times," he continued, "times when it's easy to give up, to accept that this is just how things are. But Eliza and Cade remind us that we have choices, that we can build something different if we're willing to do the work. So here's to them. And here's to all of us for having the courage to be part of something better." Everyone raised their cups and drank. Eliza felt tears prickling her eyes. She'd spent so much of her life feeling like she didn't belong anywhere. Now she belonged everywhere, in the mountains, in town, in a community of people who'd chosen to stand together. Later, when most of the guests had left and only close friends remained, the marshal pulled Eliza aside. "Heard from the territorial governor's office," he said quietly. "They're putting together a task force on women's rights, property ownership, voting, legal protections. They want testimony from women who've had to fight for those things. I gave them your name." Eliza's heart skipped. "Me? You've got a story worth telling, and more importantly, you've got proof that things can be different, that women can own land, make decisions, build lives without husbands controlling everything. You're living evidence that the laws need to change." "I don't know if I'm the right person." "You're exactly the right person. Think about it. No pressure. But this could be a chance to make a difference beyond just our little corner of the territory." She did think about it. For weeks she turned it over in her mind. Finally she talked to Cade. "What do you think?" she asked. "Should I do it?" "That's not my decision, it's yours." "I know, but I want your opinion." He thought for a moment. "I think you should do it. Not because I think you have to, but because I think you want to. And because you're good at this, at standing up, at speaking truth. If you can use that to help other women, why wouldn't you? It'll mean traveling, being away from home, from you. I'll still be here when you get back. And Eliza, I'm proud of you, whatever you decide." She wrote to the governor's office and accepted the invitation. 3 months later, she traveled to the territorial capital and testified before a panel of legislators. She told them her story, all of it, from Red Hollow to the cabin in the mountains. She showed them the legal documents from her marriage, the property deed with both her and Cade's names on it, the testimony from the hearing that had sent Thomas to prison. "Women are not property," she said in her testimony. "We are not objects to be owned or resources to be managed. We are people with the same rights to autonomy, property, and self-determination as any man. The law needs to reflect that reality." Her testimony was one of many, but it mattered. 6 months later, the territorial legislature passed new laws. Women could own property in their own names, could testify in court on their own behalf, could enter into contracts without a husband's permission. It wasn't everything. Women still couldn't vote. But it was a start. When Eliza returned home, Cade met her at the edge of their property. He swept her up in a hug that lifted her feet off the ground. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she corrected. "All of us. Everyone who stood up, who testified, who demanded better. This wasn't just me." "Maybe, but you were part of it. That matters." They walked back to the cabin together, talking about everything that had happened while she was gone. Cade had expanded the garden. The young couple in the second cabin had decided to build their own place a few miles away. 2 more families had moved into the area, drawn by stories of the mountain settlement where people could start over. "We're running out of space," Cade said. "Might need to think about how we manage growth. Make sure we don't end up with the same problems the towns have." "Like what?" "Like people trying to control each other, like hierarchies and power struggles. We need rules, but we need to make sure those rules protect freedom instead of restricting it." They spent the next year working on that, establishing guidelines for the settlement, creating a council where everyone had a voice, building structures that balanced individual freedom with community responsibility. It was hard work, full of arguments and compromises. But it mattered. 15 years after Eliza had walked into that storm, the mountain settlement had grown into a small town of its own. Different from Red Hollow or Bridger's Stop, built on different principles. A place where women owned property, where native families lived alongside white families, where outcasts and misfits found acceptance. It wasn't perfect. People still argued, still made mistakes, still let prejudice and fear cloud their judgment sometimes. But they tried. They kept trying. And that made all the difference. On a warm summer evening, Eliza and Cade sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset. They were older now, gray in their hair, lines on their faces, bodies that ached more than they used to. But they were still here, still together, still choosing this life every single day. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you'd stayed in Red Hollow?" Cade asked. "If you'd married Thomas?" "Sometimes. I'd probably be miserable, trapped in a life that wasn't mine. Maybe I'd have left eventually anyway. Or maybe I'd have just faded, become smaller and smaller until there was nothing left. I'm glad you walked into that storm." "Me too. Even though it almost killed me, it brought me here, to you, to this life. And I wouldn't trade that for anything." They sat in silence for a while, watching the light fade from the sky. Then Eliza said, "You know what I've learned?" "What's that?" "That there's no such thing as too young for love. What I was too young for was the wrong kind of love, the kind that demands surrender instead of offering partnership. But real love, the kind we have, it doesn't care about age or timing. It just cares about choice. And you chose this. Every day. I choose this every single day." Cade took her hand, his grip still strong despite the years. "So do I." As darkness fell, lights began to glow in the windows of neighboring cabins. Children's voices carried on the evening air. Somewhere in the distance, someone was playing music. Life continued, rich and messy and beautifully imperfect. Eliza thought about the girl she'd been 15 years ago, desperate, angry, willing to die rather than accept a life she didn't want. That girl had been brave, but she'd also been lost. She'd known what she was running from, but not what she was running toward. Now she knew. She'd been running toward this, toward a life built on her own terms, toward partnership instead of possession, toward a community where people could be themselves without fear. She'd been running toward freedom, and she'd found it. Not because someone gave it to her, but because she'd taken it. Because she'd walked into a storm believing that even death was better than captivity. Because she'd refused to settle. That refusal had saved her life. It had brought her to Cade, to this cabin, to this community. It had taught her that love wasn't about finding someone to complete you or rescue you. It was about finding someone who gave you space to be yourself while you did the same for them. "What are you thinking?" Cade asked. "Just that I'm grateful for all of it, the good parts and the hard parts, because they made me who I am. And I like who I am. I like who you are too." She smiled. "I know. That's why this works." They sat there until the stars came out, two people who'd found each other against all odds and built something that mattered. Their story wasn't a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was real. And in the end, that's what made it worth telling. Not because they were perfect, but because they were human. Because they'd made mistakes and learned from them. Because they'd fought for what they wanted and refused to give up when things got hard. Because they'd proven that you don't need to be rescued. You just need to be brave enough to rescue yourself. And if you're lucky, if you're very lucky, you'll find someone along the way who's brave enough to do the same. Someone who sees you not as you're supposed to be, but as you actually are. Someone who doesn't try to change you or control you or make you smaller. Someone who just stands beside you and says, let's build this together. That was worth more than any rescue. That was worth everything. As the night deepened and the temperature dropped, they went inside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new reasons to keep choosing this life they'd built. But tonight, they had this: warmth, safety, love, freely given and freely received. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything they'd ever needed. And somewhere out in the darkness, in towns and settlements across the territory, other women heard their story and thought, maybe I could do that too. Maybe I could choose myself. Maybe I could walk away from what's killing me and toward what makes me alive. And some of them did. They left bad marriages. They claimed property in their own names. They built lives that belonged to them. They proved that change was possible, that courage was contagious, that one person's refusal to accept the unacceptable could inspire others to do the same. Eliza and Cade's story wasn't just about them. It was about everyone who'd ever felt too young, too old, too different, too much. It was about choosing yourself when the world tells you you're being selfish, about building a life worth living even when people say it can't be done. And it was about love, not the kind that restricts and controls, but the kind that liberates and empowers. The kind that says, be yourself and I'll be myself, and we'll see what we can build together from that foundation. That was the lesson. That was what mattered. Not the dramatic confrontations or narrow escapes, but the daily choice to keep showing up, to keep trying, to keep building something better than what came before. Because in the end, that's all any of us can do. Try, build, choose, and hope that our trying makes the world a little bit better for the people who come after us. Eliza Warren had been told she was too young for love. She'd proven them wrong. But more importantly, she'd proven that the question wasn't about age at all. It was about whether you had the courage to claim your own life and the wisdom to share it with someone who respected that courage. She had both, and that made all the difference.